Chapter 31. Second Year. Sirius returns. Saturday, 6th of January, 1973. Peter, James and Remus arrived promptly at King's Cross to return to Hogwarts on the Saturday before term began. They all peered around looking for their fourth, but Sirius was not there, nor was Regulus. As the train pulled out of the platform, James went in search of someone to ask. He returned with his hands over his nose, where a large boil was beginning to form. Narcissa said it's none of my business, he explained, sitting down heavily. Maybe they're using the flu network? Peter guessed. Maybe his mum didn't trust him to get on the train with us? Maybe. James stared out the window, rubbing his sore nose. Remus had never seen him so unhappy. James had been missing Sirius more than any of them, and had been so excited at the prospect of seeing him once they got to London. Remus and Peter tried their hardest to cheer him up, but it was as if he was missing his right arm. Before leaving, Mr. and Mrs. Potter said they would see what they could do about having Remus to stay with them over the summer too, and he thanked them profusely. It wasn't likely, though, so he didn't get his hopes up. Instead, he just tried to be grateful that he was returning to school for a few more months with his friends. Most of them, anyway. Sirius was nowhere to be found at dinner that evening, nor did he appear by the time they were getting ready for bed. James and Remus had brought his Christmas presents back for him and piled them on top of his pillow, still wrapped in bright shiny paper and ribbon. 3 of the packages were from Andromeda, and Remus knew they were albums. Sirius had asked for Everything and Anything by David Bowie. Sunday, 7th of January, 1973. On Sunday morning the bed was still empty, and the 3 Marauders sat around trying to distract themselves with homework. Remus had finished his and took the opportunity to get started on his Christmas books, now that he could invoke his reading spell once more. James took to pacing the room, went to ask McGonagall where Sirius was. She didn't know, and even tried Narcissa a second time. She cursed him again. Finally, he went outside to do a few laps of the Quidditch pitch on his broom. Peter went too, with a box of biscuits to nibble on while he watched. Remus stayed indoors where it was warm, reading, or at least pretending to. Now that he was finally alone, he began to think about things Mr. Potter's friend Darius had said about his father, turning the new information over in his mind like a coin. His father was good at dueling. He'd heard that before. Lyle Lupin had obviously had a temper too. This was a new piece of intelligence, and an odd thing to know, after so long not knowing really anything. For the first time, Remus considered that his bouts of rage might not have anything to do with his condition. And who was Greyback? The name alone made him feel hot and uncomfortable. He wished more than anything that James and Peter hadn't been there to hear it all. Remus sat by the window in Gryffindor Tower, his book slack in his lap, staring into space and trying to make sense of a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces to. Occasionally he glanced out the window to catch a sight of James acting even more recklessly than usual. "What the hell is he playing at?" a voice squeaked over Remus's shoulder. It was Lily Evans. She was sipping a mug of tea, staring at James on his broom. "Nervous energy," Remus shrugged, not turning to look back at her. The light from the window would cast his face into sharp relief, and his scar, while no longer red and angry, was still very noticeable. "James Potter nervous?" Lily scoffed. "I had no idea who's capable of such complex emotions." "Oi!" Remus objected, still looking out of the window. "It's not been a great Christmas for him, all right?" Okay, I'm sorry. I know he's your friend." She always said that right after she insulted one of the Marauders. "How was your Christmas?" "Great, thanks. You?" "Brilliant." He could hear the grin in her voice. "Mum and Dad finally let me get an owl." "Oh, terrific." "What about you?"
"Got some books."
"From your, the people you live with?" He finally looked at her, even more irritated. Why wouldn't she just get lost?
"No, from my friends."
"Oh, of course, yeah." Lily was consciously looking away, at the space just to the left of Remus's head. He sighed heavily. Everyone was going to see it anyway. At least Lily was polite enough not to ask any rude questions. Remus went upstairs in the end, drew his bed curtains together and settled into conjurer's cartography. The others eventually came up for bed too, speaking quietly, thinking he was asleep. The exercise had done nothing to calm James down. Remus could hear his rapid heartbeat and smell the cloying scent of anxiety. It was perhaps an hour after lights out that the door creaked open again. Sirius had returned. There was no mistaking his familiar footfall. Remus felt a wave of relief wash over him, a knot in his stomach that he hadn't realized was there, beginning to uncoil. James and Peter slept on as Sirius tried to keep his movements quiet, creeping into the room and over to his bed, quickly climbing in and drawing the curtains. Remus lay still, listening to Sirius lying still too. There was something different in his breathing. Eventually curiosity got the better of him and he got out of bed. Not wanting to intrude, Remus trod as close to Sirius's curtains as he dared and whispered,
Sirius?
"James?" he replied eagerly.
Remus.
"Oh." There was a moment's awkward silence.
I just want to sleep, Lupin. Speak tomorrow, okay? Okay.
Remus padded back to his own bed and closed his eyes, feeling no less concerned. Monday, 8th of January, 1973. The next morning, Sirius had already left before any of them woke up. His present, still unopened, had been pushed to the side of the bed. His trunk had arrived at some point, and his broom was back on its shelf. James saved him a seat at breakfast, but he never turned up, and they didn't see him at all until their first lesson. "He wouldn't miss McGonagall," James said confidently as they pressed toward the classroom. "He loves Transfiguration." When they entered the room, however, they were all in for a shock. There was another boy sitting in Sirius's seat. He was smallish and hunched over, with pale, pointed features and big blue eyes. His hair was shorn close to his scalp in the same way that matrons shaved Remus's head every summer. It looked darker than Remus's, though.
Who's that?
Peter whispered a little bit too loudly. The boy turned to look at them.
Sirius!
James gaped. Sirius coloured slightly and looked straight ahead as if he hadn't seen them at all. James slid into the seat beside him. "What happened? Where have you been? What did she do to you?" Sirius shook his head.
Later,
he murmured. The classroom had filled up now and everyone seemed to be whispering behind their backs. Remus couldn't blame them. He couldn't stop staring either. It wasn't just the lack of hair, although that was incredibly disconcerting. Sirius just wasn't Sirius without his hair. He also had dark shadows under his eyes, and there was not a trace of humour on his lips. "All right, settle down, please." McGonagall entered the room. She glanced at Sirius. Her eyes widened for a millisecond as she recognized him, but she said nothing, addressing the class. "Your end-of-year exams begin in 3 months. Let's see who's been paying attention." McGonagall didn't call on Sirius once to answer a question, though it was usually the only way she could get him to pay attention. Nor did she bother any of the other Marauders, who spent the entire lesson shooting worried looks at their friend. When Transfiguration ended, they packed up their things and followed Sirius hurriedly out of the door. "What happened?" James asked, trying to keep up with Black's brisk clip.
"I said later," Sirius returned. "Wait until break, okay?"
"But what did she—"
"I'm fine."
The next lesson, History of Magic, was agony. James was beside himself and even resorted to passing notes to Sirius, who steadfastly ignored them. He sat stiffly, back straight, eyes on the board. For the first time in 2 years, Remus saw him actually reading his history text in class. Something was very wrong indeed. They couldn't get out of history fast enough. James grabbed Sirius's arm and practically marched him outside to the nearest courtyard, where they chased away a group of first-year girls who were doing handstands against a wall, skirts tucked into their knickers. It was icy cold out, though no snow had fallen yet. The sky was paper white and a storm was on its way. Once the coast was clear, James stared Sirius down, eyes full of feeling, deep creases in his brow. "What happened?" Sirius sighed heavily.
"What's it look like?"
He gestured at his head. Remus had the peculiar feeling that neither of them cared he and Peter were there. That's just how it was between them, like their nightly chats. "Your mum did that?"
"Well, I didn't do it myself, did I?"
he snapped angrily. James didn't react, just kept looking at his friend. That was James's secret, Remus realized suddenly. He was always patient, and he never took anything personally. How else could you be best friends with someone like Sirius Black? Sirius was now rooting in his bag and pulled out his red Gryffindor hat, which he had so far never worn. He crammed it over his shorn head.
"Bloody freezing," he muttered. "Dunno how you cope, Lupin."
Remus shrugged and smiled, pleased to be acknowledged. Sirius leaned heavily against the wall, looking at his feet.
"They let me come back," he said quietly. "They almost didn't. One wrong move and they've promised to send me to Durmstrang."
James and Peter gasped. Remus made a mental note to ask about it later. Sirius continued.
"Didn't get my voice back until Christmas dinner. Had to play my part for that. Everyone was there, all of the Sacred 28, except the Weasleys, obviously. Lucius Malfoy really bloody hates me now, but he had to be really nice to me and Reg. Slimy creep. Got away with wearing my Gryffindor tie until Mum noticed and vanished it. Then I may have set off a few dung bombs during the 4th course."
Peter, Remus, and James all winced collectively. "That's why... the hair?" James asked again tentatively. Sirius looked up.
"She said seeing as the usual punishments weren't having any effect, she'd try something different. I tried to get Pomfrey to grow it back for me, but the old bitch said she wasn't a beautician. Thought I'd done it myself by accident or something." "You could tell her,"
Remus started, feeling the need to defend the nurse. Sirius shook his head.
"Not worth it."
"Regulus?" James asked suddenly. "Is he back too? He sent us a note to let us know you got home, but we never heard anything else." Sirius nodded.
"Yeah, he's back. Kept his hair, obviously. Dad sorted out a port key into Hogsmeade. He's still, a bit of a tosser, but he didn't choose to be a black either. He just plays the game better than I do."
He looked past them all, his eyes wide and desperate. Remus felt an awful ache in his chest.
"I just wish,"
Sirius said. But nothing more. The bell rang and they had to get back to their lessons. Chapter 32. Second Year. Gryffindor versus Slytherin. Everyone in the school knew about Sirius's dramatic new look by the end of the first day. James and Peter had took to walking round either side of him through the corridors like bodyguards, shooting glares at anyone who dared snigger or whisper as they passed. "It doesn't look that bad," James assured him, watching Sirius stare at himself in the mirror. They were hiding in the empty second-floor girls' loo during lunch to avoid any more staring. James was lying, Remus thought to himself, and Sirius probably knew it. It looked really bad. He seemed so much smaller. Without the dark hair framing Sirius's face, his eyes appeared larger than ever, making him look young and anxious. His high cheekbones and sharp eyebrows stood out more than ever, giving him a mean, gaunt sort of look. It was no wonder everyone stared. In fact, barely anyone glanced at Remus's new scarred face because of the distraction. Still, Remus thought glumly, hair grew back. Sirius rubbed his head, still watching his reflection. Peter laughed nervously. "You look like Lupin." James nodded, eyes darting between the two of them. "Yeah, you do a bit." Sirius looked at Remus, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, Remus saw him smile. That Sirius Black smile. Nothing could ever ruin that.
"Oh yeah, I think I see it,"
Sirius said, still rubbing his head. He reached out and pulled Remus into the mirror's frame so that they stood side by side, staring at each other.
"We could be brothers."
Remus laughed too, despite himself. Sirius's real brother was waiting outside Gryffindor common room later that evening. He was sitting on the floor with his knees drawn up, staring into space. His hair was still long enough to touch his shoulders. His friend Barty Crouch was leaning against the opposite wall, looking bored. He'd made a paper aeroplane and was directing it lazily up and down the hallway with his wand. Crouch and Regulus were as inseparable as James and Sirius. Barty was fair-haired and weedy, with a mean streak longer than Snape's. Remus already recognized him by his cruel, barking laugh alone. Regulus stood up smoothly as the Marauders approached. Remus felt inside his pocket for his wand, just in case. "There you are," the younger boy said, a tremor of nervousness in his otherwise arrogant tone. His eyes kept flicking towards James. Barty's paper airplane began circling them all.
"What do you want?"
Sirius asked. "Just seeing how you are."
"No different from last night,"
Sirius shrugged. "I didn't see you at dinner."
"Wasn't at dinner,"
Sirius replied unhelpfully. They'd sent Peter down to the kitchens to pinch some sandwiches and sat in front of one of Remus's hidden alcoves to eat. Remus was quite enjoying this game, avoiding the rest of the students, even the Gryffindors. Usually James and Sirius would do anything in their power to be noticed. Remus much preferred flying under the radar. "Can I talk to you?" Regulus addressed his older brother. Sirius spread his arms as if giving Regulus the floor. Regulus rolled his eyes, irritated. He didn't quite have the same mouth as Sirius, Remus noted. He had a weaker jaw, smaller lips. "I mean alone," he said, shooting looks at James, Peter, and Remus.
"No,"
Sirius said simply. Regulus sighed. He clearly knew Sirius too well to try and argue. Barty Crouch's paper airplane began spinning faster over their heads. Peter was watching its progress anxiously. "Fine," Regulus said, folding his arms. "I just wanted to let you know that Mother and Father asked me and Narcissa to watch you and report back to them." Sirius made a noise of disgust. Regulus continued, not dropping his gaze. "And we're not going to. We're both staying out of it, okay?"
"How noble of you,"
Sirius replied. James grinned. Regulus rolled his eyes again. "I'm telling you I'm not your enemy, you idiot. Nor is Narcissa. You can do whatever you like. That's between you and our parents."
"Good."
"Good." The two brothers continued to stare each other down. If it had been James, he'd have broken into a smile, slapped Sirius on the shoulder, and all would be forgotten. But Regulus was just as pig-headed as Sirius, and couldn't tell when to end a fight. Peter let out a yelp like a whipped puppy, crouching down suddenly. Barty Crouch had obviously gotten bored of the family drama and decided to dive-bomb the smallest of the Marauders with his sharp paper plane. Crouch was giggling meanly as the plane backed up and prepared for its second attack, when James pulled out his own wand. "Incendio," he said, lazily, flicking his wrist in Crouch's direction. The plane, wings now alight, went soaring toward the first-year boy with frightening speed. Crouch let out a cry of anguish, covering his face with his arms as the flaming projectile flew straight for him, only to fizzle out mid-air, crumpling in a pile of ashen cinders inches from Crouch's face. "Let's go," Regulus muttered to his friend, who'd gone pale and was staring at James warily. They both set off back toward the dungeons. "Narcissa said to tell you good luck for Saturday, Potter," Regulus threw over his shoulder as they rounded a corner. James ignored him, following Sirius through the portrait hole. Once they were all in the common room, Remus asked,
"What's Saturday?"
"Quidditch match. Gryffindor versus Slytherin," James replied promptly. "Ah." Remus was no good at keeping up with the Quidditch schedule. He only went to the Gryffindor matches, and the last one had fallen on the day after a full moon, so he'd missed it anyway. He tended to tune out when the others started talking about tactics and league tables, burying his nose deeper in his book.
"I hope you trash 'em, mate,"
Sirius growled, throwing himself into the nearest armchair. "Plan to," James said jovially, sitting on the arm of the chair. "So long as she doesn't get the snitch too early. And Marlene's the best beater we've had in years, so—" James stopped short, realizing what he'd said. He looked at Sirius. Sirius groaned and stood up.
"I'm going to bed,"
he said. Saturday, 13th of January, 1973. It had snowed overnight. If Hogwarts had been any normal school, Remus thought to himself grumpily, they would have called off the stupid match. But no. Instead, Gryffindor Common Room was buzzing with excitement with the talk of how they were perfect flying conditions. Peter and Remus spent half the morning trying to cast long-lasting warming spells on James's kit. Sirius had done one of his early morning vanishing acts and was nowhere to be seen. Adil Deshmak, the Gryffindor team captain, made the team eat together at breakfast rather than with their friends. They all sat there looking pale and tired, eating uniform bowls of porridge and fruit, on Deshmak's orders. James was the only one in a good mood, even though they hadn't gotten the warming spell to work. Are you serious? Lily yawned as she took a seat next to Remus, biting into a slice of heavily buttered toast. Dunno. Ugh. Remus yawned back, hugging his hot cup of tea as if his life depended on it. Sulking somewhere, probably, Peter said bitterly. Remus gave him a sharp look. What? The blonde boy frowned indignantly. He calls me whiny all the time. He'll be here, Remus said, ignoring Peter. He wants to see us destroy the Slytherins. Even Lily grinned at this, despite her usual pleas for inter-house unity. Today she was decked out in red and gold from head to toe, just like everyone else. After breakfast they walked out to the Quidditch pitch together. The Gryffindor quarter of the pitch was bedecked with red and gold flags and streamers, plus 4 large banners displaying the golden Gryffindor lion. Thankfully, someone had also cleared the snow from the benches. Lily and Peter wanted to get the best seats at the very top of the spectator stands, and Remus was already shivering despite wearing 2 jumpers under his cloak. Cold, Remus? Lily glanced at him as he tried to blow hot air into his gloved hands. Just a bit, he replied sarcastically, too bad-tempered to be polite. Here! Lily pulled out her wand and grabbed his wrists, pointing into his palms. Calidum vestimenta! At once a delightful warmth spread through his hands to the very tips of his frozen fingers. How did you do that? He asked. We've been trying all morning. I think it's in the pronunciation, Lily shrugged. She quickly applied the same spell to Remus's cloak, then to Peter's. By the time this was done, the 2 Quidditch teams were gathering on the pitch, which had cleared enough for them to make a path through their changing rooms at least. They stood in 2 neat rows, one scarlet, one emerald. Remus could clearly make out a few of the players. James's unmistakable mop of jet-black hair, Marlene's fluffy sandy blonde ponytail. He could also see Narcissa Black on the opposing team, tall and willowy, her platinum hair woven into 2 neat braids which reached halfway down her back. Still no Sirius. Of course, Peter was blathering to Lily. We don't actually need to win this one. We just need to keep our points up. So long as we finish with at least 6 goals, then we stay at the top of the league. Black's a brilliant seeker, but Slytherin overall are pretty poor, especially when you look at James. Having him's like having 3 chasers in one. Lily was nodding politely. People so seldom listened to Peter when it came to sport. Remus certainly didn't. He attempted to read Sirius's dog-eared copy of Quidditch Through the Ages, but nothing in it could help him make sense of the ridiculous point system. Madam Hooch blew her whistle below them, and the players mounted their brooms, squatting, ready for kick-off. Still no Sirius. Remus craned his neck, looking round the stands, but even with his excellent eyesight he couldn't spot his friend anywhere. Surely Peter wasn't right. He couldn't be off sulking somewhere. They thought he was over his rejection from the Quidditch team. He'd been at every match that year to support James, just because this particular match was against Slytherin. Madam Hooch blew her whistle again and released the snitch. The players shot into the air like red and green cannonballs. Still no Sirius. Peter and Lily were on their feet, cheering with everyone else, so Remus got up too and attempted to look involved in the game. James had possession of the quaffle within seconds of being in the air, and had it through the hoop in under a minute. The red crowds exploded with triumph, but were quickly overshadowed by a deafening noise like a thunderclap. What was that? Lily stared about, wide-eyed, along with everyone else. Even the players on the pitch looked startled. Remus looked up and saw that the lions and Gryffindor banners above them appeared to have come alive, and were now prowling back and forth across the red material, growling and tossing their heads restlessly. Is that normal? He asked, pointing. Lily and Peter shook their heads, speechless, as the enormous lions roared above them. Remus smiled suddenly. He recognized that magic, playful and a bit scary. Look! He pointed again. At the bottom of the spectators' stands, nearest the ground, a young Gryffindor in bright red robes was also stalking back and forth, waving his wand like a conductor's baton. It was undoubtedly Sirius. Who else had that overconfident strut? But he was no longer bald, and had instead donned an enormous golden wig, like a lion's mane. Remus thought he could even see a gold tail dragging from behind his robes. Once everyone had seen him, the crowds laughed, even Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff. But Slytherin did not. The green-coloured portion of the crowd merely glared at the garish show of house pride. James was clearly not distracted by the new mascots, but instead encouraged by them, which must have been Sirius's intention. He scored at least 3 more goals, resulting in 3 more ear-splitting roars, while the Slytherins struggled to recover from the surprise. "We are Gryffindor!" Sirius was chanting, his voice magically amplified. "Mighty, mighty Gryffindor!" the crowd screamed back. Once he got used to all the noise, Remus began to enjoy a Quidditch game for the first time. James was like a red blur on the pitch, darting this way and that, though the other chasers were very good too, managing to keep up with his complicated formations and passes. Marlene, bat in hand, was doing a stunning job of not only protecting the chasers and seeker, but aiming bludgers at the other team. Narcissa in particular. Narcissa Black, however, was in her own league. She had an elegant, smooth flying style that Remus recognized from Sirius's attempt to teach him formal flying. She was quick and always moving, like water. The Gryffindor seeker was following her movements, hoping she would lead him to the snitch, but she kept dodging and making false turns to confuse him, twice sending him directly into the path of a bludger. She wasn't showy like James. She was efficient and ruthless. Gryffindor had a 100-point lead when Narcissa finally saw the snitch. Remus noted the moment she caught sight of it. Her posture changed. She didn't look away even once. She hovered for a few moments, glancing behind her to see where the Gryffindor seeker was. He was hanging back, unsure what she was planning. At that very moment, Maisie Jackson, one of the Gryffindor chasers, scored another goal, bringing Gryffindor's score up to 130 against Slytherin's 20. The Gryffindors went wild, and Sirius waved his wand even more enthusiastically. The lions not only roared this time, but leapt clear through the banners, out into the winter air, where they became strange golden shadows striding across the pitch. The Gryffindor seeker dived to dodge them, clearly terrified, though they vanished just above his head. "No, you idiot!" Sirius's voice echoed over the cheering. It was too late. Narcissa had taken advantage of her opponent's distraction and scooped up the snitch. She flew above the crowds, holding it aloft triumphantly. The Slytherin crowd finally burst into applause, sending up green and silver sparks, cheering, "Black! Black! Black!" Of course, this was highly confusing, as the Gryffindors were also chanting, "Black! Black! Black!" as Sirius took bows before the crowd. James swooped down to land beside him and ruffled his friend's ridiculous mane, as the crowd now chanted, "Potter! Potter! Potter!" "Oh well," Peter grinned up at Remus. "We lost, but we're still tied with Ravenclaw in the league table, still going through to the final." Remus couldn't care less. Afterward, they poured into the pitch to congratulate their team. Remus and Peter both punched Sirius playfully. "You never told us! We could have helped!" Sirius just smirked and tossed his glorious golden hair. "Sirius!" A thin, cold voice broke through the crowd. They all turned. Narcissa was striding toward them, still in her billowing emerald robes, a bright silver medal hanging round her neck that made Remus shrink back behind Peter. Sirius stood to face her. She gave him an unexpected smirk. "Take off that obscene wig," she said sharply. He complied, rubbing his bare head self-consciously. Narcissa pulled out her wand with one sweeping motion and tapped his head. "Placere!" The Marauders and the crowd of Gryffindors round them all gasped. Sirius's hair began to grow, like black water tumbling from his head until it was back to its usual length. "What the—" Sirius grabbed his head. Narcissa grinned, showing rows of pearly white teeth. "That's for your help in ensuring a Slytherin victory." With that she turned, silver plates whipping round, and flounced off toward her own team. James tugged on Sirius's newly restored tresses. "I'm never going to understand your bonkers family, mate." Chapter 33. Second Year. Discoveries. After the landmark Gryffindor vs. Slytherin game, it felt as though time was speeding up for Remus. Part of this was down to the balance having been restored to their dorm room. James was once again the hero. Sirius' rebellious streak was back in full flow. Peter was no longer treading on eggshells around either of them, and Remus had no peace and quiet at all, though could hardly complain about it. As if trying to make up for lost time, James and Sirius tore through the final weeks of winter with a renewed zest for pranks and mischief. They spent half their time under the invisibility cloak, casting hexes at unsuspecting students in the halls, raiding the kitchens and causing upset in the dining hall. At least 3 or 4 nights a week they crept out together with Remus's map to plot the castle, though most of the time they returned with armfuls of sweets from honeydukes instead. Peter often tried to tag along, but Remus needed all the sleep he could get. His January and February full moons were not good. Neither was quite so bad as the December moon that had left him so obviously scarred, but neither were at all pleasant. Madame Pomfrey was relentless in her quest to find a solution. In January she tried vanishing his fingernails. "Only temporarily, you understand. You'll have them back in the morning." But it did not stop his claws from growing in once the transformation took hold. Remus was somewhat relieved by this, as she'd had plans to vanish his teeth next. In February, she tried securing his arms and legs with magical manacles to stop him from hurting himself. She was extremely apologetic about these measures, even more so when she returned in the morning to find he dislocated both shoulders breaking free of the shackles. He was too tired to care very much. While engaging in less pranks than he had the year before, Remus chose to throw himself into his studies. Secretly, Remus hoped to take advantage of Sirius and James's determination not to focus on their schoolwork. He wanted to come top in History of Magic again, and knew he had a good chance. Not just that. His marks had been getting better and better in Transfiguration, Herbology, and Astrology too, and he at least had the chance to be in the top 3. Charms and Potions still belonged to Lily Evans, but he wanted to close the gap between them as much as possible. As such, he finally overcame his fear of the library and spent almost every free hour he had in there completing essays and revising. His reading had improved a fair bit. He was still slow if he didn't use the spell, but he found that his constant practice helped him recognize the letters much faster than before. Lily was often in the library too, and after a few days of nodding politely to each other across the desks, Lily gathered up her things and came to sit next to him. They got along very well together, either reading quietly or querying each other on various points. Inevitably, Lily was the second person after Sirius to discover Remus's secret. "Why do you do that?" she asked, looking at him curiously. "Do what?" "Every time you open a new book, you put your hand on it and scratch your head with your wand." "No, I don't." Remus put his wand down guiltily. "Yes, you do," Lily said calmly, a small smile playing on her lips. "You muttered something too. Was it a spell?" Oh, go on, tell me. Is it something to do with the books? Is that how you figure everything out before I do?" Remus was so pleased by this compliment that he dropped his guard for once. "Promise you won't tell anyone?" "Promise." "It's to help me read. I can't... Well, I find it harder than everyone else, reading the normal way." "How does it work?" Her eyes grew wider, as they always did when she was excited about something. Remus was surprised. She didn't seem at all interested to hear that he couldn't read normally. "Like this," he showed her. She copied him, but looked disappointed. "It didn't work." "It's really hard to do," he explained. "Took me ages to get it right." "Where did you find out about it? That's really, really advanced stuff." "I didn't. Sirius did. I don't think it's written down anywhere. It sounded more like he bunged a few different spells together. Probably why it's a bit clunky." "Really?" If Lily's eyes got any wider, they were in danger of falling out of her head. "I knew he was cleverer than he acts in lessons. Oh, that git! Show me again." As well as Lily, Remus often found he was joined by her friends, Mary and Marlene. At first he was unsure about this arrangement. He usually tried to avoid the other girls in his year purely out of instinct. Plus, the two M's were generally to be found giggling at the back of the class or fawning over some wizard celebrity in the common room. However, he was pleasantly surprised to find that both girls took their studies just as seriously as he did, and in fact that their interest in wizard pop stars was hardly different from Sirius and James's obsession with their favourite Quidditch teams. Mary was particularly nice to talk to. She was Muggle-born and from South London. Her accent made Remus feel strangely at home. She was unpretentious and had a broad smile and a loud, infectious laugh. Marlene was slightly quieter, but hysterically funny and able to mimic almost anyone in school, including the teacher. Her McGonagall was spectacular. Remus actually cried with laughter. The three girls were exceptionally kind to Remus, and he knew this was mostly because they thought he was ill. He didn't mind, though, because he was learning plenty of interesting things from them. For one, Mary had a spell for covering up blemishes, which didn't completely vanish his scars, but noticeably reduced their appearance. He'd never even thought to look in a beauty magazine for a solution. They introduced him to various other girly things. Mary had a crush on Sirius and Marlene on James. Remus thought they were both completely mad and wondered if they felt the same way if they had to share a bathroom with Potter and Black. In return, Remus helped them with history of magic, since he was apparently the only student in the whole school who actually found Professor Binns interesting. Marlene was excellent in astronomy and showed him how to plot his constellations using some clever mnemonic devices. "You're so nice, Remus," Mary said in her usual blunt manner one evening as they walked back to the common room together. "Marlene and Lily were proper scared of you in first year." "What?" Remus almost dropped his books in surprise. "Mary, don't be rude," Marlene hissed. "You were pretty aggressive," Lily explained, "and James started telling everyone you were really rough and that you were in a gang." Remus snorted with laughter. As they entered the common room, he quickly spied Sirius, James, and Peter huddled in a corner, poring over a very large, very thick book. Marlene and Mary burst into fits of giggles when they saw them and ran upstairs. Lily shared a knowing look with Remus before following them. The Marauders looked up as their friend approached, and Peter very consciously covered the book they were reading with some sheets of parchment. "All right, lads," Remus said, craning his neck. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," said James brightly. "Where have you been?" "In the library," Sirius stated before Remus could open his mouth. "With his fan club?" Remus smirked. "Piss off, Black. I know when you're jealous." He had elected not to tell his friends that Marlene and Mary fancied them. Their egos might not be able to handle much more inflating. Anyway, he didn't want to change the topic. "Seriously, what are you hiding there?" All three of them looked at each other guiltily, and Remus felt a sting of hurt. They were up to something without him. He ought to have known. He supposed it was only fair. He'd refused to take part in any pranks for so long that now they didn't want to include him at all. "Your birthday!" Peter suddenly burst out. "It's coming up." "Yeah," Remus scratched his head, thrown. "Next week." "We're planning a surprise," Peter said, grinning widely, very pleased with himself. Remus did not miss James's look of annoyance, and he knew at once that Peter was lying. Fine, if they didn't want to tell him. "All right," he swallowed, forcing a smile. "Well, you better not be planning to embarrass me like last year." "Oh, no, never," Sirius grinned, standing up, gathering the book to his chest, title still hidden. "Are we the sort of friends that would want to embarrass you, Lupin?" "Yes, you are," Remus nodded, slowly narrowing his eyes. "No singing, no big parties, nothing that's going to—" "Get you into trouble. We know," James finished, standing up too. "Hey, why don't we invite your new friends, eh? Do us good to mix with the fairer sex, don't you think?" "Right," Sirius tossed his hair. "More like you want a chance to get Evans on her own." "How dare you?" James replied, cheeks slightly pinker than usual. "So if you're not in a gang," Mary mused a few days later. They were checking each other's herbology essays, and Mary was the fastest reader, so she'd already finished. "Where'd you get all the cuts and bruises?" "Pet rabbit," Remus replied, still reading Marlene's essay. "Vicious temper." Lily grinned at him. "Oh yeah? I thought you lived in a home." "I do," he said coolly. "We're allowed pets." That was somewhat true. There had been a goldfish for a time, until the tank got overturned by one of the older boys in a rage. "Oh, in a children's home?" Mary looked up. "Are you Muggle-born too?" "No," Marlene said promptly. "Lupin's a wizard name. Your dad." She looked at him for confirmation. He nodded, unsettled. "Yeah, how'd you know?" "I saw the name on a trophy." "A trophy?" "Yeah. Can't remember what for. I think it was outside the Ravenclaw common room."
Oh, right.
He'd never so much as glanced at any of the trophies except for the Quidditch Cup, which James stopped to pay homage to at least once a week. He was suddenly filled with an irrepressible urge to run all the way to the Ravenclaw corridor and drop the essay he was reading. Lily was watching him.
Go, Remus,
she said softly, taking the parchment from him. The other two girls were looking at him too, somewhat pityingly. They nodded. He practically leapt up. He wasn't sure exactly what he'd expected. He could barely read for a few moments. He was so out of breath from sprinting up 3 flights of stairs. The case was mahogany and glass, regularly polished by Filch, or the house elves, he supposed. It was stuffed full of trophies and awards for 100 different achievements. Wizard chess champion, Tri-Wizard tournament victor, Drubal's best blowing gum blowing finalist. And there it was. A huge golden statuette depicting a wizard raising his wand in a silly-looking stance as if he were serving a tennis ball. Lyle Lupin, Hogwarts dueling champion, 1946. He stared at it for a long time, reading and rereading. He tried to think logically. This only confirmed things he already knew. His father was in Ravenclaw. McGonagall had told him that in first year. He was good at dueling. Exceptionally good, apparently. Both Slughorn and drunken old Darius had told him that. Really, all this did was confirm that his father had been at Hogwarts. He had belonged at Hogwarts. He'd probably touched that very trophy. Remus pressed his fingers against the glass as if he could break through and grasp it. Chapter 34, Second Year. 13. Saturday, 10th of March, 1973. The Marauders could not have been happier to discover that Remus's birthday occurred on a Saturday that year. This, in their opinion, opened up the day to all sorts of excitement that could not be possible on a weekday. As the day approached, Remus tried to ignore their teasing and heavy-handed hints about what lay in store. He didn't mind what they did. He trusted them well enough. They could be relied upon to make a fool of themselves, but they'd so far never made him the butt of the joke. James had been receiving strange lumpy packages bound up in brown paper for the past week, and Remus's only hope was that they weren't presents for him. He'd never be able to return the favour. Remus thought a lot about being 13, specifically being a 13-year-old wizard with a furry little problem. The discovery of the Ravenclaw trophy cabinet had done some very strange things to Remus's internal dialogue. He'd always thought he had a pretty good idea of who he was. A care home kid, poor, a bit weedy, angry, bad, scarred, thick when it came to school stuff, but clever enough when it counted. Coming to Hogwarts had wrought some changes, of course. Maybe he wasn't that thick, even if he was still sure of everything else. His father had been really clever. He was in Ravenclaw, after all. The Sorting Hat had considered Remus for Ravenclaw too, but changed its mind. That hadn't meant a great deal to him at the time, but now he wondered and wondered about it. What if he'd been sorted into Ravenclaw? Would he know more, now, about his father? About who he was? What if his father hadn't killed himself? What if he'd never been bitten at all? What if was a dangerous game. As he fell asleep on the night before his birthday, Remus slipped into a dream he'd not had in a very long time. He is lying in bed in a small pale blue room. It is summer and the sash window is wide open, curtains billowing. The window is huge, big enough for a grown man to get through. Remus is very small and very frightened. There is someone in the room with him, and they are going to hurt him. It's a monster. His mother promised they weren't real, but oh, she's a liar, a horrid liar, because there is a monster, and it's crossing the room now. It's coming toward him, and it'll eat him up. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? He scrunches his eyes shut and ducks under the covers and trembles and sobs. Then there is nothing. Nothing solid, nothing real. He is in pain. There is so much blood and so many tears and an awful lot of noise. He just wants to sleep. Another man looms over him, tall and slender and worried. Daddy! Lumos Maxima! Remus started awake with a jolt, nearly crying out. The dorm room had filled with bright, unnatural light. It sliced through his bed curtains, making him squint. He'd just time to wipe the tears from his cheeks before Sirius and James ripped back the heavy drapes, chanting, "Happy birthday, Lupin!"
"It's still dark out, you pricks!"
He squinted, rubbing his eyes and sitting up. He tried to will his heart to stop pounding so hard.
"It is precisely 1 minute past midnight,"
Sirius said,
"and therefore, officially, you are 13. Where's Pete?"
Remus climbed out of bed, stepping into the room. They decorated it haphazardly with streamers, which he was sure usually decked out the Quidditch pitch on match days, and strings of fairy lights left over from Christmas. "On a mission," James said, eyes twinkling. "Come on, up and dressed."
"Where are we going?" "Nowhere," Sirius replied breezily. "But you'll want to be properly attired for when your guests arrive." "My guests?" "Of course," Sirius grinned. "We tried to keep it Marauders only, but so many people wanted to celebrate with you see."
Remus couldn't tell if Sirius was being sarcastic, so he chose not to respond, instead pulling on a pair of jeans and a long-sleeved t-shirt that looked clean enough. By the time he'd dressed, there was a sharp rap at the door. "Come in!" James boomed cheerfully. Sirius saw Remus wince and explained,
"It's okay. We put a silencing spell on the room."
Remus frowned.
"So, whoever's on the other side of the door can't actually hear us?"
James clapped his head to his forehead. "We're complete idiots," he groaned at Sirius, pulling open the door. Peter stood outside, looking very pleased and very pink, surrounded by Lily, Marlene, and Mary. Remus gaped as they entered the room, all smiling widely and clearly thrilled that they had surprised him. They were all clutching cards and small packages, too.
"I didn't think girls were allowed in here."
"The lovely Mary tested it for us last week. Nothing bad seems to happen," James explained.
"One day you'll all read Hogwarts a history and I can finally rest,"
Sirius sighed, shaking his head tragically. James had begun pulling out packages from under his bed, ripping them open. It seemed they had raided Honeydukes again. Mountains of sweets were unearthed. Bertie Bott's every flavour beans, chocolate frogs, fizzing Whizbees, Drooble's best blowing gum, sherbet lemons, cauldron cakes, not to mention the haul Peter had brought up from the kitchen. Ham sandwiches, egg mayonnaise, coronation chicken, cheese and pickle, packets of Remus's favourite flavour crisps, salt and vinegar, Scotch eggs, sausage rolls, pork pies, cheese and pineapple sticks, plus some perfunctory fruit. Sirius, meanwhile, was laying blankets over the floorboards and scattering a few plush velvet cushions.
"Lupin,"
he said with a wide smile,
"welcome to your midnight feast."
"Happy birthday, Remus!" the girls chanted as one. They all sat down together and Sirius settled a record on his player. He'd eventually opened up his gifts from Andromeda. As requested, he received 2 Bowie albums, Hunky Dory and The Man Who Sold the World. "Sit next to me, Sirius," Mary said, quickly, earning a reproachful look from Marlene. Sirius shrugged and acquiesced, but leaned over to hand Remus a package.
"Open this first."
It was long and cylindrical, very light and badly wrapped.
"You didn't have to get me anything,"
Remus mumbled, untwisting the ends. "A poster?" Lily furrowed her brow, watching as Remus unfurled the thick, glossy paper. It was a huge A2 print of David Bowie in black and white, wearing a spangly silver costume and giving a slightly jerky high kick.
"I got Andromeda to send it to me at Christmas,"
Sirius grinned, unable to contain himself.
"But I enchanted it to move itself." "Wow!"
Remus smiled back sincerely.
"Thanks. It's amazing."
The girls had all got him packets of sweets and cakes, and Lily gave him a book on potions. He looked at her skeptically and she grinned. "Can't keep giving Severus a reason to lord it over you." "Please do not mention Snivelus's name on this most sacred occasion," James said with mock horror. Lily rolled her eyes and returned to her jam tart, conspicuously ignoring him. James seemed hardly to notice, just cleared his throat and looked at Remus, his dark eyes full of wickedness. "My present is coming later, once we've all stuffed ourselves to bursting." "Oh, Merlin, Potter!" Marlene giggled. "What have you got planned?" He would not tell. Remus had to admit he was quite enjoying himself. He'd hoped that James and Sirius would respect his wishes and keep the celebrations to Marauders only, but inviting the girls wasn't too bad. He knew them all quite well now, and quite enjoyed their company. Mary could give Sirius a run for his money when it came to barefaced cheek. And, as Remus had predicted, Marlene's impressions of the faculty members had the Marauders in stitches. Peter even had to go and change his shirt after snorting pumpkin juice down himself. "Starting to see why Remus has been abandoning us for you lot," James said at about 1:30, wiping tears of laughter from the corner of his eyes.
"Yeah, you're not bad for girls."
Sirius winked at Mary, who scoffed and gave him a playful shove.
"Yeah, it's got nothing to do with me wanting to get my homework done,"
Remus replied dryly, wondering if he could manage another chocolate frog.
"Oh, how the times have changed,"
Sirius said haughtily.
"You'll all be laughing on the other sides of your faces when Remus beats you in all our exams,"
Lily quipped.
"Ha!"
James got up, stretching elaborately as if about to perform some great feat. "Exams? We Marauders have higher concerns. My dear Mr. Black, Mr. Pettigrew." He made a sweeping gesture toward the dorm window. "Shall we?"
"By George!"
Sirius stood abruptly.
"Is it time?"
James closed his eyes solemnly and nodded. "Indeed it is."
"Then make haste!"
Peter cried, standing up too. The girls shot nervous glances at each other, and then Remus, who could only shrug to show them he had no idea. Sirius, Peter, and James went to the window, flinging it open. They were fidgeting from excitement, lack of sleep, and too much sugar, and kept snickering like naughty children.
"Come on,"
Peter beckoned the others hurriedly.
"you've got to see."
James had produced a collection of bright red objects which looked like a cross between space rockets and sticks of dynamite. His arms were full, and so were Sirius's.
"Are those?"
Marlene scrunched up her nose.
"Not Dr. Filibuster's?"
James just gave a maniacal smile.
"Oh, no,"
Lily said.
"we're not supposed to. You'll wake up the whole castle."
"Get lost if you don't like it, Evans,"
Sirius snapped, handing a few rockets to Peter.
"You promise not to spoil anything."
"Remus,"
Lily turned to him.
"tell them. They'll listen to you."
"No, they won't,"
Remus replied.
"Anyway, I want to see. I've never seen wizard fireworks." "You're in for a treat,"
Sirius winked.
"How many do you need?"
Mary stared, sounding impressed.
13, obviously."
"You're all going to get in so much trouble. Oh, stop being such a goody-goody, Lil."
Marlene threw her arm around the redhead. "We won't let any of you girls get in trouble," James said sincerely, his glasses slipping down his nose as he struggled to keep control of his cargo. "Don't worry."
"I'm not worried."
Lily folded her arms defiantly.
"I just think you're all being—"
Whoops! Bang!
"Peter!"
They all leaned out the window to see the rocket Peter had dropped tumbling down toward the ground in a torrent of green and gold sparks.
"Sorry."
Peter looked sheepish. Sirius laughed.
"No, great work. Now we've started, we may as well continue, eh?"
And he began to hurl his own fireworks out the window, clear into the night air. James and Peter quickly followed suit, and soon enough even Lily had forgotten to be annoyed as they stared in awe at the spectacular display lighting up the starry sky. The fireworks went on much longer than Muggle ones, some bursting 10 or 12 times before fizzling out. They changed colours from red to green to purple to orange, twisting and curling in various shapes, eventually spelling out, "Happy 13th birthday, Remus." Sirius sighed, irritated at that.
"Knew it was too many letters."
As well as the dazzling light display, the fireworks were satisfactorily noisy, so much so that Remus could already hear the other Gryffindors in the tower opening their windows to see whether the castle was under attack. He was sure he heard whoever was in the room above them mutter,
"Them bloody Marauders at it again."
Inevitably, someone began hammering at the door, and McGonagall's shrill voice could be heard on the other side.
"Potter, Black, don't think I don't know you're behind this. Open this door."
"Oh, shit," James grimaced. "Better get under the beds, ladies."
Once they'd all been thoroughly reprimanded, promised 2 months of detention and letters home to all their parents, McGonagall, who was a sight to behold in her red tartan nightie, left them, and Marlene, Lily, and Mary reluctantly returned to their own dormitory. It was 2 o'clock in the morning by then, and the boys decided it was finally time to bed. "Happy birthday, Remus!" Peter called out, followed by a loud yawn. Remus smiled to himself in the dark, his cheeks almost aching.
"Yeah,"
Sirius yawned back.
"Happy birthday, Remu."
Chapter 35. Second Year. What's in a Name? Monday, 19th of March, 1973. "I have a spot of good news," Madame Pomfrey smiled warmly. "I didn't want to mention it in case we couldn't sort things out in time, but you'll be seeing me over the summer." For a moment Remus dared hope this meant he was not going back to St. Edmund's, but the Mediwitch continued. "Mrs. Orwell, your matron at the children's home, has kindly permitted me to apparate onto the grounds at dawn following both full moons this summer." She smiled widely. Ah, well, it was better than nothing. He smiled back weakly.
"Great,"
he croaked. His arms and legs felt heavy as lead. He could barely raise his hand to drink the potion she was offering him. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and Remus had missed his lessons. He'd been asleep most of the day. Sleep was still the only remedy that seemed to really work. "I told Dumbledore I would do it with or without his permission. I couldn't live with myself if you arrived here in September in the same state you did last year."
"I could stay at a wizard's house this summer. That would be even safer," Remus tried. "My friend James—"
"I'm sorry, dear." Madame Pomfrey shook her head. "It's just not safe enough. The Potters did get in touch, but we need to preserve your anonymity for as long as we can. I know it isn't much fun for you, but it's better you stay with Muggles." Remus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It would only be 2 months, and the summer was still ages away. Stay positive. Stay positive. A sudden clattering noise at the end of the yard jerked Remus out of his meditative chant. Madame Pomfrey frowned and turned to look round Remus's bed curtain. "Mr. Pettigrew!" she shouted.
What do you think you're doing?
Sorry, Madame Pomfrey. We were just... Pick those bedpans up now and put them back in the cupboard, and you can wipe that smirk off your face, Mr. Black. Give him a hand." "Hiya, Remu." James peered round the curtain. "Sorry about all the noise." Remus grinned, trying to sit up.
"It's okay."
"Lie down," Madame Pomfrey chastised. "You've had 3 broken bones, you silly boy."
"I'm feeling much better."
Crash!
Mr. Pettigrew, what did I say?
Madame Pomfrey disappeared, looking very cross. James slumped into the chair beside Remus's bed. "Ready to go?" he asked casually. Remus could always count on James not to treat him like an invalid.
"If she'll let me."
Remus nodded to the curtain Pomfrey had just vanished behind.
"How was the match?"
"Smashed it!" James nodded enthusiastically, dropping the snitch into Remus's lap. He ran his fingers through his hair as if to regain that feeling of having just touched down. "Made one of the Ravenclaw beaters cry."
"How nice."
"How was, your night?"
"Fine,"
Remus replied dryly, twisting his mouth. They didn't often talk about the full moons, and Remus was pretty glad about that. He didn't like the idea of them knowing too much. Pain was a personal thing. 3 broken bones, did she say?
"Yeah, all fixed now, though. She's amazing. Only takes 1 spell. Muggles have to wear plaster casts for weeks and weeks."
Weird. "Remu!" Sirius whipped back the curtain. "You're alive!" He fell dramatically at the foot of the bed.
"I was convinced she was trying to cover something up. The old bat wouldn't let us come over." "Don't call her that," Remus replied irritably. "Don't call me that." "You wanted a nickname," Sirius said, sounding affronted as he climbed back onto his feet. Peter appeared, looking sullen with his hands in his pockets. "No, I don't," Remus frowned. "When did I ever say—" "Last year," Sirius said quickly. "Almost exactly a year ago, you said you wouldn't mind being called anything as long as it wasn't Loony Lupin." God, you've got a memory like an elephant.
Remus rolled his eyes.
Anyway,
He lowered his voice in case Madame Pomfrey was lurking nearby.
the whole point of having a nickname is so no one knows who wrote the map. I don't think Remu is going to fool anyone.
He's got a good point there, James said wisely. As much fun as it's been.
Fair enough.
Sirius heaved a heavy sigh.
But can we call you Remu until we come up with something else?
No.
Boring.
Sirius cast around for something else to say, conspicuously avoiding looking at Remus's bandages.
So are we getting out of here, or shall I settle down for a rousing game of Snap?
He's not going anywhere, Madame Pomfrey bustled in. I'm keeping Mr. Lupin in for observation overnight.
No,
Remus protested.
I'm feeling much better.
He always said that. Wasn't usually true, but he knew he would start to feel better eventually, and it didn't much matter whether he was in the hospital wing or not. I'm not being deliberately unkind, Remus, the nurse sighed. This is for your health.
I'll go straight to bed.
We'll look after him, James said earnestly, standing up. Remus waited to see if that worked. James was good with grown-ups, especially witches. He'd even been known to soften McGonagall once or twice, though he thought that might have had more to do with his Quidditch skills. Madame Pomfrey was unmoved. I'm sorry, Mr. Potter, but no.
Fine,
Peter said uncharacteristically firmly.
We'll stay here then.
Yeah,
Sirius and James said as one.
You'll miss dinner,
Remus said. I'm sure we can arrange something just this once, Madame Pomfrey said, trying not to smile. All right, boys, but you're to keep it quiet and get on with your homework. I'll not have you using Mr. Lupin here as an excuse to not get anything done. With a wave of her wand, 3 more chairs appeared out of thin air, along with a long pine-wood desk complete with inkwells for their quills. Remus opened his mouth to speak, but Madame Pomfrey was apparently psychic. And no, Remus, no homework for you. Just rest. Remus shut his mouth and lay back down. How was he supposed to keep ahead of Sirius and James if the woman wouldn't let him study?
Can I read?
He asked meekly. As long as it doesn't strain your eyes. She left, and the other 3 boys dutifully pulled out their homework and began scribbling. Remus craned his neck to try and see what they were working on. He was all up to date on his, but had been doing some extra reading in charms in an attempt to defeat Lily in their upcoming exams. Remus covered his work with his sleeve. No looking, Remu. You just rest.
Call me loony,
Remus groaned.
Anything but Remu.
But it suits you, Sirius said over his quill.
Remu.
Stop it, or I'll bite you.
Remu. Remu.
Peter joined in, all 3 boys giggling hysterical but trying not to be heard.
I hate my name.
Remus covered his face with the book he was reading. It wasn't fair. James Potter was so reassuringly ordinary. Peter Pettigrew was perfectly respectable. And Sirius Bloody Black was the coolest name ever, whichever way you looked at it.
Might as well call me anything you like. I don't know what could be worse.
Loony Remu? James suggested helpfully. Remoony? Sirius could hardly breathe for laughter.
Hey, Moony,
he snorted, collapsing onto his desk, shoulders shaking. Moony is actually quite good, Peter suddenly said very soberly. Moony, as a nickname. Remus stared at him, unaccustomed to paying very much attention to anything Peter said. He thought about it, rolling the name round in his head. It sounded like Loony, but it was nowhere near as horrible.
I don't hate it,
he said finally. I love it, James said. Moony. Suits you.
Won't people, catch on?
He worried, chewing his lip.
Nah,
Sirius waved a hand.
We'll tell them it's after that muggle in the Who.
They're all muggles in the Who, Remus replied.
But I don't play the drums. You do like hitting things, though,
Sirius suggested.
Thanks. No problem, Remoony.
Some hours later, after Madame Pomfrey had brought them all dinner, James had left for Quidditch practice and Peter for a detention. Sirius had given up on his homework long ago and was instead attempting to perfect a tentacle arms jinx on himself. Remus was stalwartly ignoring his behaviour. He knew that Sirius was pronouncing the incantation all wrong, with the emphasis in the wrong place, but he wasn't going to tell him, because he wasn't sure exactly why Sirius wanted a tentacle arm so badly, and it couldn't be for any good reason. Eventually, bored, Sirius leaned back on his chair, feet propped up on Remus's desk.
"What are you reading, anyway?" "The Epic of Gilgamesh,"
Remus replied, turning the page. He was nearly at the end, and his reading spell was waning. If Sirius could just leave him alone for 5 minutes...
"What's it about?"
"It's yours," he said, surprised.
"I got it off your shelf." "Oh, one of the Muggle ones? I haven't read many of them, to be honest. They were my Uncle Alphard's."
"Right.
So? So what, Black? What's it about?" "A man called Gilgamesh." "Okay, you have to agree that's a worse name than Remus Lupin."
Remus chuckled.
"Yeah, all right. It could always be worse." "So tell me about this goulash bloke." "Gilgamesh. He was a king, a long time ago." "Ah, see, now I'm hooked. That's how all the good stories start."
Sirius cupped his head in his hands, staring at Remus as if he were a professor teaching Sirius's favourite subject.
"No, you're just putting off your astrology essay." "Pfft. I'll copy James's."
Sirius waved a casual hand.
"Tell me more, O keeper of knowledge. I've read to you plenty of times."
Remus sighed, putting down the book. There was no getting out of it when Sirius was in that sort of mood.
"Gilgamesh was a king. Yeah, a long time ago. You've established that. Look, shut up or piss off." "Okay."
Sirius held his hands up in surrender.
"Carry on." "So he was a king, but not a good one. He wasn't fully human. He was 2/3 god, so he was stronger than everyone else, and his people were frightened of him. He was dangerous. So his people prayed. That's when you asked the gods for help, and the gods sent another man to help control Gilgamesh." "Was he even stronger?" "No, he was part animal." "So this beast man killed Gilgamesh?" "No, they fought each other for a really long time, but Gilgamesh still won. He didn't kill Enkidu, though. He sort of recognized they were equals, and they became friends, best friends. They have all these adventures together, fighting other monsters and stuff. It's cool." "I want to know more about the beast man." "Enkidu. He's master of the animals, and he was happy living in the wild. But then after he's sent to control Gilgamesh, he can't ever go back to nature, so he never really belongs." "But he has his friend, right?" "Yeah, but I don't want to spoil the ending for you." "It's okay, I never really read the Muggle stuff." "You're missing so much," Remus exclaimed. "Oh well, okay then. Enkidu dies." "What?" "Yeah, it's sort of sad. He was my favourite character, too." "But why?" "To teach Gilgamesh about death, I think. Before Enkidu, he was too arrogant to believe anything could hurt him. But after he loses him, he realizes he's not the master of anything. No one can control death." "That's really depressing, Moony."
Remus shrugged. It all seemed pretty straightforward to him. Chapter 36. Second Year. Love and Marriage. Friday, 20th of April, 1972. Still don't know what I was waiting for, and my time was running wild. A million dead-end streets, and every time I thought I got it made, it seemed the taste was not so sweet. So I turned myself to face me, but I've never caught a glimpse of how the others must see the faker. I'm much too fast to take that test. Remus loved Hunky-Dory more than anything. It was by turns bright and happy, then dark and introspective. He felt that David Bowie must have some superhuman insight into his soul. Even if he didn't always fully understand the lyrics, he felt as though somehow they made sense. He hummed the tune to changes quietly under his breath as he walked up and down the dark library shelves, his wand lit for a better look. He really ought to be catching up on potions, but Lily had offered to help him over the weekend, and he'd already been revising Transfiguration all day. It had taken that long to turn an old top hat into a rabbit and back again. Remus finally found the shelf he was looking for. The British Wizard's Guide to Nuptial Laws, 1700 to 1950. He'd hoped that would be recent enough. It was huge, and he had to get up on a stepladder to reach it. Stretching, Remus just about had purchase on the dusty old leather cover and was about to pull it down toward him when another hand reached up and grabbed his wrist. Yelping, Remus yanked his hand back and almost toppled off the stool, coming face to face with Narcissa Black. "Ugh, it's you," she said distastefully. She was a head taller than him, so they came about the same level as long as he kept his balance. She did not release his hand. "Give me that." "No, I had it first," he replied, still trying to pull away. She had an iron grip. "Go away, little boy. What could you possibly want with this?" She gave him a hard shove, and he toppled backwards, landing painfully on his backside. Narcissa smiled down at him, victorious, holding the heavy tome. He scowled. "What do you want it for?" "That's none of your business," she breezed, tossing her pale hair out of her eyes in a manner eerily similar to Sirius. She turned and began to walk away between the gloomy stacks. Remus scrambled to his feet. "Wait," he said, trying to keep his voice down so Madame Pince didn't throw him out again. "Oi, Narcissa, wait!" She spun around with furious eyes, her wand raised. Remus instinctively grabbed his own wand just in time. They both stood like statues for a few moments. He knew that she had cursed James and Sirius on several occasions, and that the whole Black family knew all sorts of dark magic. But at the same time, Remus had never cursed a girl before. It felt wrong. "I just wanted to know," he said, carefully choosing his words, "if it has anything to do with you and Sirius. The engagement thing." She lowered her wand slowly, regarding him with suspicious interest. "So he's told you all about that, has he?" She raised an eyebrow, which was still as inky black as her natural hair colour. "Yes, little boy, that's exactly what I need it for. You don't think I want to be married to that whiny little blood traitor, do you?" Remus just shrugged. The truth was, it hadn't actually occurred to him how Narcissa felt about any of it. He'd been so focused on helping Sirius, he hadn't considered whether anyone might be trying to work on exactly the same problem. Narcissa sighed impatiently. "Well, I don't, and I'm not expecting my brat of a cousin to come up with any solution any time soon, so here I am." She didn't sound angry anymore, just bitter. Now that he was closer to her, Remus could see that she had dark rings under her eyes. "I want to find a solution," he said, tilting his chin up to meet her gaze, wishing he wasn't shorter than her. "I've been trying, anyway." "Ha!" Narcissa laughed humorlessly. "A second year? And what have you come up with, She tapped her black pattern heel on dark floorboards. "Well," Remus swallowed, "not much. Nothing good enough yet, unless you were already married." "I've thought of that," Narcissa snapped. "But I'm not of age yet. I'd have eloped with Lucius the moment they proposed this ridiculous engagement, but I'm not 17 until October." "Right." Remus nodded, surprised to hear this. "And it can't wait because of the betrothal ceremony this summer, right?" "Correct." She was looking at him with slightly less venom now, as if she found the conversation amusing rather than irritating. "But I was thinking, what actually is the ceremony?" he asked, feeling braver. "What do you and Sirius have to do?" "Oh, the usual Black family rubbish," she replied. "A banquet, astrological charts, probably a commemorative portrait of the two of us. Mother still has Bella's hanging up in the dining room." The thought of a portrait depicting 13-year-old Sirius and his 16-year-old cousin was repulsive to Remus. Narcissa didn't sound like she relished the idea either. "This is all his fault, you know," she said, acting as if he's some special case. "If he'd simply followed tradition like the rest of us, toed the line until he was old enough to get out—" She trailed off, her eyes bright with angry tears, which she wiped away quickly.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm marrying Lucius, and that's all there is to it. Thank goodness he stood by me through all of this. Anyone else would have walked away.
Remus didn't like to comment. What did he know about relationships? He'd never seen one up close. They were silent for a few moments while Narcissa composed herself. Once she had, she gave a stiff nod and looked at Remus again.
I shan't curse you, she said magnanimously. But I am warning you. I've had just enough of people meddling in my future, so keep your nose out of it from here on out.
With that she turned and left, leaving Remus with plenty to think about. Monday, 30th of April, 1973. Moony, what are all these books for? James asked as he tripped over a pile Remus had carefully stacked near the dorm entrance. They were useless, and he'd been planning to take them back in the afternoon.
Just some research, he replied, not looking up from his current book. Where have you been?
Plotting. Sirius followed James behind him, stepping over the scattered books which his friend was trying to clear up. Remus raised an eyebrow.
Plotting? Map or mischief?
Bit of both, Sirius grinned, throwing himself into Remus's bed. He picked up a book.
Wizard wedding rituals?
He laughed.
Who are you marrying, Moony? Not Evans. James will have to challenge you to a duel.
I do not fancy Evans, James spat from where he squatted on the floor. Magical marriages, he read, picking up the final book and placing it on top of the pile. Seriously, Remus, what's this all about?
I'm trying to help you.
He kicked Sirius gently with his foot.
Someone's got to get you out of this stupid engagement.
Oi, Sirius scowled.
I'm doing everything I can.
What are you doing?
Haven't I got more detentions than everyone else this year? I must get a howler a week. And my lions. Don't forget my lions at the Quidditch match.
Remus stared at him, dumbfounded.
How is that supposed to help? I'm proving that I'm not the marrying type.
No offence, mate, James put in, coming to sit on the bed with them, but I don't think your lot really care that you're not the marrying type.
Exactly, Remus said. You're the heir. You have to marry another pureblood, and the Black family have a long history of intermarriage. Even your parents are cousins. How do you know?
Sirius looked uncomfortable.
I've been reading.
Remus gestured at all the books.
There's loads of stuff in the library on your family. One of the oldest wizarding houses in Britain, traced all the way back to the Middle Ages, where the family's seat was in Inverness in Scotland. I know all this. Sirius waved a hand. Yeah, but did you know that you aren't the first Black who wanted to get out of a marriage? Well, obviously Andromeda, though that was more that she did want to marry, only Ted was the wrong sort. Not just her. Lyra Black defied the family's wishes in 1901 to marry into the Crab family, and Delphinius Black was supposed to marry his niece in 1750, but left at the altar and married Fidelia Bulstrode. And your Uncle Alphard never married either, though there's no explanation. Yeah, we're not supposed to talk about him, Sirius replied edgily. I've heard Mother ranting about him, and I'm pretty sure he was a queer.
There was an awkward silence. My dad knew Alphard, James said. He said he was an all-right bloke.
He was always nice to me, Sirius shrugged. Left me his money and everything. Made sure no one else can touch it until I'm of age. Makes my parents furious, you know, that he didn't return all his cash to the family vault. So I have to give him credit for that, even if he was, well, whatever.
Remus's throat was very dry and he cleared it, wanting to move on.
So anyway, it just goes to show that you can get out of that sort of thing. Only problem is, I can't find any good details about how they all got away. Don't bother, Sirius said gloomily. Even if you did find out, none of them had my mother to contend with. You know what she's like. She's probably going to make us take the unbreakable vow.
She wouldn't, James said aghast.
She'd do anything.
Sirius nodded. Remus chewed his lip thoughtfully. He didn't know what an unbreakable vow was. It sounded like dark magic. From what he'd already read about the House of Black, he knew that the library's restricted section would probably have to be his next stop. He'd have to borrow James's cloak for that, and go at night. No matter. He refused to be deterred from this. He owed it to Sirius. Hadn't Remus once told Sirius that his own problem was hopeless, inescapable? And hadn't Sirius worked tirelessly, learnt to perform complicated NEWT standard magic just to help him? This was no different. He had to work harder. Knowing that Narcissa was also working on the problem was strangely comforting. Remus knew from her curses that she must be a very accomplished and clever witch, and there was no doubt in his mind that she usually got her way. I'm marrying Lucius, and that's all there is to it. There had to be something in that. He remembered Flitwick telling them that love, natural, everyday human love, was one of the most powerful types of magic. While Remus didn't personally feel that anything about Lucius and Narcissa's coupling was natural, exactly, he knew that it was a lot more powerful than family honor. It had to be. Chapter 37. Second Year. Exams. May, 1973. Exam season began at the worst possible time for Remus, round mid-May, right when the full moon was due. The moon itself fell on a Friday, which meant he was able to attend his potions test that morning, but he lost the whole weekend to sleep when he normally would have preferred to revise. More than that, the moon had thrown his magic off completely. He thought it was happening less in his second year, but as their exams got closer, whether it was nerves or the lengthening days, Remus found his magic growing stronger, wilder, and harder to control. The slightest wand movement caused the most fantastic results, and sometimes he'd barely finished speaking the incantation before light was bursting from its tip, making his fingers tingle with shock. James had taken to say, "Calm down, Moony," at least 3 or 4 times a day, as Remus attempted to practice various basic transfigurative spells and charms, which inevitably went too far. He thought that just doing simple incantations might help him gain more control, but this was apparently not the case, as he smashed the dorm room window a 3rd time attempting to levitate his gobstone set. "Reparo," Sirius muttered, glancing over the top of his astronomy revision. The window fixed itself at once. Remus sighed. "You really need to relax, mate," James grinned. "We don't have any practical exams until next week anyway." "I'm so behind, though," Remus grumbled, collecting up his gobstones and putting them back in their box. "If you're behind, then what am I?" Peter wailed from the floor, where he had 5 texts spread out in front of him, all different subjects. "I know I'm going to fail Transfiguration. My rabbit hasn't changed at all this year, and I know she's going to make us do something really hard." "At least you're good at potions," Remus shot back. "And herbology. I can't even remember which leaves mean what." "You beat me on our last herbology quiz," James reminded him. "And you've got us all by the bollocks when it comes to history of magic. I've been copying your homework all year." "But you're the best at Remus started, but was interrupted by a loud thump as Sirius threw his astronomy book to the floor. "Will you all shut up? I'm trying to revise," he yelled, standing up. "Like a bunch of old women nattering. I'm going to the library." He pulled his satchel over his shoulder and stormed out of the room. They sat in silence for a little while. Peter gnawed his lip, looking on the verge of tears. James sighed. "Ignore him, he's just in a mood because he has to go home soon. Not that I blame him," he added quickly. "Parents like that and all." "Suppose," Remus shrugged, though he didn't think it was a good enough excuse, really. It wasn't as if he, Remus, was much looking forward to the summer holidays either. All right, fine, he didn't have to marry his cousin or attend weird, stuffy banquets, but nor did Sirius have to be locked up in a cell once a month or hide from much older, rougher boys whose greatest delight was shoving your head in the bogs. "He's not staying with you again, then, James?" Peter asked nervously, probably quite looking forward to a Sirius-free summer, as it meant he could have James all to himself. "Nah," James said, sounding much less cheerful at the prospect. "He's got an open invite, obviously. All of you have." He eyed Remus. "But we don't reckon it'll happen after the fiasco at Christmas. He thinks he'll be locked up completely until the betrothal ceremony." Remus felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He still hadn't come up with a workable solution to that. Between revision and the full moon, he hadn't thought about it properly in 2 weeks. Judging by Narcissa's behaviour in the halls, hexing anyone who so much as looked at her sideways, she'd not fared much better.
Well, if he keeps acting the way he does, he'll lose more than his hair next time,
Peter said primly, sorting through his notes. What do you mean? James frowned, sitting up. Saying it's his own fault?
No.
Peter looked alarmed at James's tone.
No, I just mean... Well, you know, the other day he packed all those Gryffindor house banners in his trunk. He wants to put them up in his bedroom to annoy his parents. Stuff like that is exactly what gets him into trouble.
Nothing wrong with a bit of house pride, James sniffed defensively, though he shot a nervous glance at Sirius's trunk. Remus didn't get involved. Personally, he agreed with Peter and Narcissa. Sirius was his own worst enemy, a lot of the time. For someone so intelligent and magically gifted, he completely lacked subtlety or even forethought. If he didn't have to mouth off at every opportunity, then maybe he wouldn't have found himself engaged at the age of 13. Remus knew better than anyone the importance of keeping a low profile, especially when you were different from everyone else around you. James, who was more like Sirius than Peter or Remus, wholeheartedly disagreed. In his mind, the most important thing was to always fight back. But if everything was a battle, then inevitably somebody had to lose. And until he was of age, that was going to be Sirius. Every time.
Excellent, Mr. Potter!
McGonagall gushed uncharacteristically as James transformed his rabbits into a perfect pair of red velvet slippers with a fur trim. Remus took a deep breath, steadying himself for his own attempt. It was a week and a half since the full moon, and he was finally back in control, though his nerves still got the better of him sometimes. He watched Sirius lazily wave his wand over his own rabbits, and they too transfigured into a lovely pair of black wool booties. Peter's slippers still had ears and a tail, even after 3 attempts, and left droppings on the desk. When Remus took his turn, he closed his eyes first, feeling light-headed, before finally uttering the incantation. The slippers were not nearly as neat as James and Sirius's, but they were wearable, and at least no longer had any leporine features, even if they stayed a dull brown colour. At least he knew he'd done his very best on the theory paper. In fact, on all his theory papers. He was satisfied he'd remembered everything he needed to remember when it came to his best subjects, and that he hadn't done too hideously in potions, herbology, or astronomy. At the end of the Transfiguration exam, McGonagall returned all of the rabbits to their original state and sent them hopping back into their hutch at the back of the room, ready for the next exam. She then began to hand out sheets of parchment that looked like blank timetables.
"You will be aware," she said very formally, "that in your 3rd year you may choose a minimum of 2 additional subjects to take up to ordinary wizarding level. Here are your application sheets. If you will please think very carefully, reviewing each subject's merits, then please complete the form and return it to my office no later than the last day of term."
The class began to murmur excitedly, and Remus looked down at his form and the subjects listed there with great trepidation. As they filed out of the room, Peter immediately began to badger James to find out which subjects he'd be taking, so he could take the exact same ones.
Muggle studies,
Sirius said as they headed outside into the summer sunshine.
Definitely going to take Muggle studies.
Remus rolled his eyes. There was no surprise there. If any subject was going to win the general disapproval of the Black family, then there it was. Do you think Evans'll take that? James scratched his chin. Sirius grinned.
Doubt it, mate. She's Muggle-born. You can impress her with your knowledge, though.
Yeah, maybe. James looked down thoughtfully.
"Are you going to take that then, James?" Peter asked anxiously. "Do you think it'll be difficult? I suppose we could just ask Remus for help. Are you taking it, Moony?"
Nah, Remus shook his head. What's the point? You lot do it, though. Then maybe you can stop asking me stuff.
He secretly wished there was a wizarding studies subject he could take, so he didn't feel quite so out of his depth all the time. But he supposed that was the arrogance of wizards.
Divination. That's like fortune-telling, right?
James sat down on the grass, throwing off his robes. Sirius followed suit, rolling up his shirt sleeves.
I think so. Crystal balls and tea leaves.
Sounds like a right, Doss. Let's do that. All 3 of them scribbled onto their papers. Remus did not. He did not like the idea of knowing the future. Whatever he had coming to him, he was sure it wouldn't be good. He tapped his temple with his wand quickly and whispered, Lectuncula magna, beginning to read through his options. Arithmancy, he murmured. Is that like arithmetic? Numbers, anyway, Sirius replied. It's supposed to be really difficult. Care of magical creatures. Don't know about that, James snorted. Have you seen the teacher? He's got more scars than Moony. Oi! Remus kicked his ankle. Care of magical creatures had actually sounded quite interesting to him. After all, he sort of was a magical creature himself. I think I'll do arithmancy if you are, Sirius said, still reading his paper. Will it be really difficult? Peter worried. We'll help you, Pete, don't worry, James soothed. Anyway, there are better things about third year than extra homework. Hogsmeade! You go to Honeyduke's 3 times a week, Remus replied, mulling over the possibility of ancient runes. Yeah, but Zonko's! Remus grinned at him. He was actually pretty excited about the Hogsmeade trips. He'd never been to any of the protected wizard areas other than Hogwarts, and he was sick of hearing about how great Diagon Alley was. He sighed and laid back, looking up at the clouds. He would think about his third-year subjects later. There was no hurry. For now, he wanted to enjoy the end of exams and revel in the thought that they still had almost a full month before school ended. Oi, Evans! James sat up suddenly. Remus sighed inwardly. James had been acting more and more of an idiot where Lily was concerned ever since the midnight feast. I'm not a dog, Potter! Her voice echoed across the grounds. Don't yell at me like that! Hi, Sirius. Mary's voice now. Remus sat up, blinking. Marlene gave a shy wave, which he returned. All right, MacDonald. Sirius nodded, casually sweeping his hair behind one ear. He started doing that whenever girls were around. Remus hated it. All 3 girls had ice creams, which looked like an excellent idea considering the unreasonably warm weather. Lily had even charmed a Chinese fan to follow her around, creating a cool breeze wherever the 3 girls went. Give us a lick, then, James winked at her lewdly. Marlene turned beetroot red and dissolved into giggles, but Lily remained calm, arching one red eyebrow. You do look like you need cooling off. Aguamenti. With that, she aimed her wand at the Marauders and sprayed them all with icy cold water. Remus leapt out of the way, but she wasn't trying to get to him anyway. James and Sirius got the worst of it and shouted in dismay as their hair and shirts were drenched. Mary, Marlene, and Lily cackled with glee. What'd you do that for? Sirius growled, pulling his dripping hair apart to glare at them, looking like a drowned rat. Thought you liked practical jokes, Lily winked at him before turning away and walking toward the lake. Complete nightmare, that one, Sirius groaned, trying a hot air charm on his hair. That's my future wife you're talking about, James replied dreamily, watching her go. His glasses had steamed up comically. Stop being so dramatic, you'll dry out in half an hour in this heat. Where do you think they got the ice cream? Peter asked distantly. Remus smiled, lying back. Never mind going home, or betrothals, or new subjects. For now, everything was just as it should be. Chapter 38. Second Year. The Long Last Day. Part 1. Friday, 29th of June, 1973. Remus was running late, and there was still so much to do. As usual, he'd slept later than the rest of the Marauders, and by the time he woke up, Peter was the only one left, scurrying out of the door with a quick, "Morning, Lupin! Good luck!" Checking the clock, Remus leapt out of bed and ran for a shower in a state of panic. As he combed his hair in the mirror, thinking glumly that this might be the last time, as Matron was sure to shave him bald as soon as he was back at St. Edmund's tomorrow, he ran through the list in his head. Breakfast first, of course. Couldn't miss that. If he got a move on, then he might just catch James and Peter before they set off on their own missions. It would likely be his only chance to see them, because today, the very last day of term, the usually united Marauders would be conspicuously separate until the feast. After breakfast, he would have to run back upstairs to pack. Remus was quite sure that they would have a detention coming their way that evening, and he might not have enough time next morning before they had to catch the train. Once he'd packed, he needed to return his library books. This filled him with a sense of guilt. He still hadn't found anything to help Sirius despite weeks of research. Their only hope now was that the Black Cousins would be able to find a way out of the engagement after the betrothal ceremony had taken place. On his way to the library, he'd be able to drop off his subject applications form at McGonagall's office. He'd put that off far too long already. Then, books returned and form handed in, Remus thought he'd have ample time to meet Peter outside the greenhouses at 11 o'clock, where he would collect the invisibility cloak. As long as everything went by clockwork, Remus should be able to take the umbrellas he needed from the gamekeepers' sheds on the ground and smuggle them back to their dorm room. Then it would be about lunchtime. Remus was hoping to use that hour to finish reading his book in peace. He'd borrowed it from Sirius and only had a chapter left, so he really wanted that out of the way before they all had to go home, especially as he sincerely doubted that McGonagall would allow him to read during his inevitable detention that evening. Shortly after lunch, the first stage of the Marauders' end-of-term plan would come into effect. He would avoid the mayhem and double-check he'd packed everything, possibly doing a bit of Sirius's packing too, because the other boys still hadn't done it, and Remus suspected he was leaving it to the last minute. Then the preparations for the feast would begin. All he had to do was show up early enough to help James and Sirius with the final incantations. This was provided, of course, that none of them got caught before then. There was a sudden knock on the bathroom door just as Remus was pulling up his jeans.
"Toast out here for you, Moony," Sirius's voice called. "Thought I'd save you some." "Oh, great, cheers," Remus called back, pulling up his shirt quickly, as if Sirius might see him through the wood.
"Good luck. See you this afternoon."
"Yeah, you too."
Remus heard Sirius's footsteps retreat and disappear down the staircase. Well, at least that was one thing taken care of. He emerged from the steamy bathroom and saw the plate of toast sitting on his trunk. 4 slices. Sirius had not been stingy, and each liberally coated with a different spread. Remus grinned and renewed his pledge to help Sirius pack later on. He spent a leisurely hour munching on the toast and collecting up various belongings which had spread themselves far and wide from his bed to his friends' shelves, even down in the common room. He took the opportunity to play hunky-dory one last time, saying a fond goodbye to the record player for a few months. The David Bowie print Sirius had given him for his birthday no longer moved, which Remus was somewhat glad for, because at least that meant he could take it back to St. Edmund's without arousing any suspicion. His trunk didn't seem to close as easily as it had at the end of last summer, when he'd been on his way to Hogwarts, and he had to rearrange the items several times before everything squashed inside. Remus brushed his teeth and went to gather his library books, stuffing them into his threadbare satchel. He wondered if Matron might let him have a new school bag. Mind you, last time he'd asked for one, she'd taken the opportunity to teach him how to sew. A life skill, she'd said. He didn't bother telling her that the repairing charm worked much better, but even that wasn't much use anymore. With his list of chosen subjects in hand, he headed down into the common room where every other Gryffindor seemed to be doing their last-minute packing too. The usual cosy space was in an uproar, with shouts pleading for the return of missing books and games, students crawling under tables and lifting sofas hunting for long-lost items, groups of tearful 7th-year girls hugging everyone goodbye, and owls swooping this way and that.
"Remus,"
Mary stopped him on his way out.
"You all by yourself?"
"Yeah," he nodded with a mischievous grin. She grinned back.
"Oh, what are you planning? Me and Marlene were just saying how you've been quiet for the last few weeks." "Ask me no questions, and I'll tell you no lies," he replied. "Sorry, but I've got to return my books." "Lily's looking for you," she said quickly. "Oh, I'll be in the dining hall for lunch. Bit busy until then. Tell her sorry."
With that, he hurried through the portrait hole and out into the corridor, which was just as busy with students rushing back and forth, saying their last-minute goodbyes. Peeves, caught up in the excitement, had obviously found out wherever Filch stored the toilet roll and was flinging wads of wet tissue at anyone who got close enough. Arms over his head, Remus scurried toward McGonagall's office just as Peeves fired at the door. Remus ducked just in time, and Peeves flew off, laughing maniacally as McGonagall, having heard the very loud splat, opened her office door. She peered down at Remus, still squatting and covering his head.
"Mr. Lupin!"
"It was Peeves." He stood up quickly. "Honestly, Professor."
"I believe you."
She gave a small smile.
Spirits are always high on the last day of term. Have you got something for me?
The old teacher glanced at the parchment he was clutching.
Oh, yes.
He stuck out his hand.
Excellent. Do come in, Lupin.
He could hardly say no to McGonagall or ask her if it could wait till later. He wondered what on earth she wanted. Surely Sirius and James hadn't been caught already. It would be pretty obvious as soon as Phase 1 of the plan was initiated, and he'd heard nothing.
Sit down, Mr. Lupin. Tea?
Yeah, okay. He sat down uneasily. McGonagall waved her wand, and the little tartan teapot on her desk began to pour its contents into 2 matching cups.
Help yourself to the milk,
the professor said absent-mindedly as she scanned the list of parchment he'd given her.
Divination, she said. Muggle studies, and arithmancy.
He didn't say anything. She looked up finally, surveying him over the tops of her square spectacles.
These are the same subjects Mr. Potter and Mr. Black have chosen, if I'm not much mistaken. Mr. Pettigrew too,
Remus just nodded. Actually, Peter was only taking divination and Muggle studies. He'd found out that you needed to select a minimum of 2 new subjects and decided not to push himself any further than necessary. Remus would rather die than take on less work than James or Sirius.
I'm interested to know what prompted you to select Muggle studies in particular, considering a future in Muggle liaisons, perhaps?
Remus stammered. He had no idea what the Muggle liaisons office was, but it didn't sound very interesting.
I'd have thought you'd have sufficient knowledge of the Muggle world, having spent so much of your life in it.
Yeah, but... well...
There are no need for you to take subjects simply because your friends are, Mr. Lupin, Professor McGonagall said, more kindly than he'd expected. You'll still be taking some of the same core classes, after all.
Remus shrugged. He didn't know what else to do. Really, all the subjects had interested him. Okay, perhaps not Muggle studies, she was right there. But in the end, he hadn't much liked the idea of missing out on lessons with the other Marauders.
One of the most wonderful things about school, Mr. Lupin, McGonagall began tactfully, is the friends we make, connections and relationships that last a lifetime. I know I've made some very dear friends at Hogwarts.
Remus fought a grimace. Did she have to make it sound so girly? She cleared her throat, clearly amused by his reaction.
Some very dear friends. But school is also the place to challenge ourselves, to test our mettle. Do you understand?
He nodded blankly. She sighed, sipping her tea.
Your exam results were excellent this year, Remus.
He straightened up a little at that. He was pretty chuffed with the results himself. He hadn't beat James at Transfiguration, or Snape and Lily at Potions, but in everything else he had some of the highest marks in his class.
As such, McGonagall continued, I have no concerns in permitting you to study arithmancy, which I must tell you is one of the most challenging courses we offer at Hogwarts. But I would question whether Muggle studies is a suitable use of your time going forward. You might find it very dull, I'm afraid. Have you considered, for example, ancient runes?
Remus twisted his hands in his lap. It had sounded quite interesting, but he'd spent so much time struggling to read English and catching up with the rest of the students that he balked at the idea of learning another language. McGonagall seemed to sense his concerns, at least in part.
You wouldn't find it as difficult as you think, you know. You're an immensely gifted scholar and a very hard worker. In addition, your fellow Gryffindors, Miss MacDonald and Miss McKinnon, will be in the same class.
That didn't sound too bad, actually. He was very fond of the 2 M's now, and it would be fun to spend a bit more time with them. How nice it would be to have a lesson in which there was no Sirius showing off, no Peter trying to copy his notes, and no James trying to act like a prat to get Lily's attention. Okay, he said. I'll give it a go.
Excellent!
McGonagall smiled widely, looking genuinely pleased. She waved her wand over his form to amend it. Professor? He asked suddenly, slightly nervous again.
Yes, Lupin?
But I was thinking about another subject too. Maybe instead of divination? McGonagall's smile turned wry.
Well, I can't pretend I've ever seen much use in divination myself. Not unless the witch or wizard concerned is genuinely gifted with the sight.
Remus nodded, assuming that this meant he was not thus gifted.
Well, I thought maybe... I mean, it's probably silly.
James had said it was silly, a girly subject.
Care of magical creatures,
he said all in a rush. McGonagall looked genuinely surprised.
That's something which interests you.
Yeah, I suppose so. Not just because I'm, but yeah, I suppose mainly because of that.
Well, it is a very interesting subject. McGonagall sipped her tea again. I would say that if you're more interested in that than divination, then by all means.
Great, okay, change it.
He nodded, feeling a bit embarrassed, but also quite pleased with himself. McGonagall waved her hand once more.
Your father was rather gifted when it came to magical creatures, you know, she said.
Remus raised his eyebrows.
I didn't know.
Oh, yes,
she nodded as if she was just passing the time of day.
An expert in his field.
His field?
Non-human spiritus apparitions. Boggarts and ghosts, you know. Dementors, too. All rather dark, I'm afraid. Care of Magical Creatures mainly focuses on corporeal, that is to say, mortal creatures, but you may well share his talents.
Oh, right. Thanks, Professor.
He got up quickly. He didn't have time to think about his father now. He had so much to do.
I've got to get to the library.
He indicated his heavy bag splitting at the seams.
Yes, quite,
McGonagall nodded.
Thank you, Remus. I'll see you at the feast tonight.
Yeah, bye.
As he finally exited McGonagall's office, Remus glanced at the clock. It was 10 to 11. Damn. No time for the library now. He had to meet Peter on the grounds, and it usually took at least 15 minutes to get out of the castle, providing none of the staircases forced you off track. Having his unreasonably weighty book bag, Remus sighed and set off on his way. By the time he reached the greenhouse, sweating and too hot in the bright sunshine, Peter had obviously been waiting a little while and was wringing his hands.
There you are. I thought something bad had happened.
Sorry,
Remus panted, wiping his forehead with his sleeve.
McGonagall wanted to chat. Everything go okay?
Yep,
Peter nodded, eyes darting around.
Just like James told me. Have you seen them?
Nope.
Everything should be okay then. Here.
Peter handed Remus the invisibility cloak.
Cheers. Oh, are you going back to the dorm?
Yeah, I still need to pack.
Great. Mind taking my books back? I wanted to return them to the library, but McGonagall...
Okay.
Peter took the bag.
Bloody hell, Moony,
he groaned, sagging under the weight of it.
I'll see you at lunch.
Probably. Good luck.
Peter went scurrying off back toward the castle, leaving Remus alone again. Glancing round to make sure the coast was clear, Remus wasted no time in approaching the equipment shed. He'd been in it once before for a detention in his first year. It was much bigger on the inside than it looked, and full of various tools for maintaining the expansive Hogwarts grounds. The lock did not respond to the usual Alohomora incantation, but it obviously did respond to a few quick twists with one of Lily Evans' hairpins. She'd given him the pin the evening before with a quizzical look, but hadn't asked why he needed it. Once inside, Remus acted quickly, finding the large black trunk of umbrellas. He wasn't sure why wizards still used umbrellas. Surely there were spells for protecting yourself from rain. But nevertheless, they didn't want anyone summoning them and ruining their fun. Remus covered the trunk with the invisibility cloak and cast a weightlessness charm on it before levitating the whole thing out of the shed. He strolled back up to the school in a leisurely manner, trying not to look as though he were up to anything at all, hiding his wand under his robe so no one could see that it was guiding the invisible trunk. It took a good half-hour to navigate himself and the trunk through the castle unnoticed, and without bumping into any of the other students. Several times he had to levitate the thing over his own head, which took a bit of effort and concentration. Still he did it, reaching his destination with an enormous sense of achievement. He left the trunk in the dorm room and performed a sticking charm on the lock. If anyone did try to summon it, they hopefully wouldn't be able to get it open in time to save themselves. He folded the cloak neatly and left it on James's pillow. Peter had dropped Remus's book bag at the foot of his bed, and Remus sighed to himself, realizing that he would have to return the books before he could go for lunch. Hoisting it onto his back, he once more descended the staircase into the Gryffindor common room. Once again he was waylaid, this time by Lily, who looked extremely flustered and extremely pleased to see him.
There you are,
she shrieked, grabbing his shoulders.
I've been looking everywhere for you.
Hi, Lily, he smiled politely. Sorry, can it wait? I've got to get to the...
Absolutely not.
She shook her head vehemently.
Can we go up to your room? The others aren't there, are they?
No, he sighed. He could go to the library later if he skipped trying to finish his book, or if his visit to Madame Pomfrey didn't take too long. He followed Lily back up the stairs.
Do I want to know what that is?
She asked, glancing at the big black trunk.
It's a trunk full of umbrellas,
he said promptly. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't question him further.
I've got something for you.
She put down her bag on top of the trunk, rifling through it. She withdrew a very strange item. It looked like a sheet of clear plastic. Remus furrowed his brow as she handed it to him. He turned it over.
Lily?
I'm sorry it took me so long. I had to wait ages for the acetate. My mum got it from a friend of hers who's a teacher. They use them for overhead projectors in Muggle schools. Well, you know that, obviously.
Remus nodded blankly. There had been an OHP at St. Edmund's, but it needed its light bulb replacing about 3 years ago, and as far as he knew, no one had yet got round to it.
Got a book?
Lily nodded at his bag.
Get one out, I'll show you.
He complied, curious to see where this was going. She opened the text at a random page, placed it on the trunk, and lay the acetate over it.
Look,
she said. Remus looked, about to withdraw his wand in case she wanted him to read something. She shook her head, pushing his hand away.
Just look,
she said. He looked again, rubbing his neck. There are 3 key elements to performing a successful unbreakable vow. In the first instant...
What?
Remus exclaimed, picking up the book and staring.
Did it work?
Lily looked at him eagerly.
Can you read it?
Yeah, Bloody hell, Evans!
He flipped the page again, replacing the acetate. It worked. It was much less fiddly than Sirius's spell.
It should work outside of Hogwarts too, she said, her green eyes sparkling. I fiddled about with the incantation bit, and there was some potion work involved, but it should last a good long time.
You're amazing,
Remus said, still reading.
Thank you so much.
Quite out of the blue, Lily leapt at Remus, flinging her arms round his neck and hugging him. Taken a bit by surprise, Remus felt himself blushing. He'd never been hugged very often before, let alone by a girl. She was soft, and her hair smelled nice, like apples.
I wanted to do it in time for your birthday, she said, stepping back, still smiling, but I kept messing it up. Thank goodness it worked. You'd have thought I was mental if it hadn't.
Yeah.
He laughed nervously, still recovering from the surprise embrace.
Thank you, Lily. It's such an amazing thing.
You deserve it, Remus, she said earnestly. Honestly, you work so bloody hard, and you keep up with Potter and Black.
Remus shrugged. There was a slightly awkward pause.
Look, I'll let you get on, Lily said finally. Sorry I waylaid you like that. See you at the feast?
Yeah, definitely.
Remus looked back down at the book.
Oh, shit. Wait, Evans, have you got an umbrella?
I think so. I might have packed it already.
Unpack it,
he said firmly.
And take it to the feast, okay?
Okay.
Once she'd left, Remus allowed himself a moment to sit down. He couldn't believe she'd done it. He couldn't believe he hadn't thought of it. It was so simple, so elegant. He'd be able to read all summer. He flipped to another page. It is important to note that the unbreakable vow, once made, cannot be superseded by any other kind of vow, oath, or promise made thereafter, regardless of any legal or moral concerns round keeping such a vow. It is therefore pivotal that...
Oh!
Remus gasped suddenly. It was as if there was a click in his brain and everything had fallen into place.
Oh!
He leapt up. The library would have to be put off just a little while longer. It was times like this, Remus thought, as he paced up and down the dark corridor, that he really could do with the completed Marauders map. Unfortunately, they'd so far only managed to map 3/4 of the castle and were a long way off tagging every student yet. Remus had been waiting outside the Slytherin common room for near 20 minutes now with no luck at all. The green-robed students who passed him ignored his pleas for help, and even the bloody Baron had carried on his way with a disdainful sniff. He looked at the nearest clock. It was 12:30. Phase 1 of the plan was imminent. When the common room wall opened once more, his heart sank even further. Well. Snape smirked. They said there was a mad Gryffindor on the loose, but I didn't think it'd be you, loony Lupin. Remus sighed. Piss off, Snivelus. Don't be so rude. Snape raised his wand. I ought to wash your mouth out with soap. I don't think you know how to wash, Remus replied dryly. Why, you... Can we not? Remus said irritably. It's the last day of term and there's plenty of stuff I'd rather be doing. Can you just let me in or something? Let you in? Snape's black eyes shone with amusement. Why on earth would I let you in? I need to speak to... Out of the way, Snape, you slimy git! A voice came from the wall behind Severus. Barty Crouch Jr. stepped out, followed by Regulus. Remus felt a small measure of relief. Regulus, can you get Narcissa for me? Mordio! Without warning, Crouch aimed a curse at Remus, who dodged it just in time, pulling out his own wand. Expelia... He started, but it was too late. Crouch cursed him a second time, and pain rocketed through Remus's skull, his head ringing. It was awful, but he didn't flinch. It only hurt for a little while, and he knew pain like an old friend. If they thought that something as commonplace as that would stop him, they had another thing coming. What do you want, half-blood? Crouch asked, grinning madly. Or are you just thick, hanging around here all alone? He is thick, Severus said, as two short planks. Shut up, Snape, Crouch said, turning his wand on Severus now. Remus narrowed his eyes, paying attention. Apparently Snape was bad at making friends wherever he went. Shut up, both of you! Regulus finally spoke, sounding bored. He'd been watching Remus's face the whole time. What do you want, Lupin? Better tell me before Barty fancies practicing another one of his unforgivables on you. I need to speak to Narcissa, Remus said, very clearly and as calmly as he could. It's urgent. It's about, black family stuff. Regulus watched him for a few moments longer, not speaking. He was so like Sirius, only without any of the joy or humour. If Remus hadn't known better, he'd have said Regulus was the older brother. Snape, go and get my cousin, will you? He said sharply, not even moving his head. Snape looked furious, but he obeyed. Did everyone do whatever the Blacks told them to? James often teased Sirius for acting as though he were royalty, but perhaps he was just playing the role he'd been raised for. Crouch soon grew bored and wandered off, leaving Regulus and Remus still facing each other in stony silence. Remus was actually glad to see Narcissa's sour face when she finally came through the wall. Oh, Merlin, she said, staring down at Remus. What now? I've figured it out, he said quickly. The problem. I've got a solution. Oh, yes. She folded her arms, looking unconvinced. The unbreakable vow, he hurried, keen to get it all out so that he could go. It can't be broken, ever. She snorted. Yes, that's certainly implied. Remus rolled his eyes impatiently. I mean, he said more slowly, his bravery mounting, that if you make an unbreakable vow, you can't make any other promises that go against it. You can't even be forced to make other promises. Or vows. He stressed the last word meaningfully. The light switched on in Narcissa's eyes almost immediately. For a second, her pretty pink lips formed the same O that Remus had made only an hour ago before when it came to him. She did not have time to speak, however, because in the same moment there was a shriek from somewhere up the hall, causing them all to turn. A Slytherin girl came bursting out of a girls' bathroom at the end of the corridor, wailing.
"They all just exploded,"
she said, looking faintly disturbed. Sure enough, they could see through the swinging toilet door behind her that waves of pink foam were spilling from the wash basins and toilets. It was truly magnificent. Gorgeous great drifts of soft soapy bubbles tumbled out of every tap and drain.
I've got to go.
Remus grinned, winking at Narcissa, then breaking into a run. Chapter 39. Second Year. The Long Last Day. Part 2. The rest of the afternoon was nothing short of chaotic, and Remus knew that Sirius and James, wherever they were, must be having the time of their lives. Every single bathroom in the castle had mysteriously been affected by the foam flood, and no one seemed to be able to stop it for very long. Huge drifts of bubbles clogged the hallways like pink snow, and those students who didn't want to play in it did not appear to mind being forced out onto the grounds to loll about on the grass and spend their last day in the sunshine. Remus, who already had to sacrifice his lunch hour, still needed to get to the library and return his books, help Sirius pack, though actually, he told himself as he pelted up the stairs to Gryffindor Tower, he'd done quite enough to help Sirius for one day, and see Madame Pomfrey for an end-of-year checkup. He also needed to get to the Great Hall early to help James and Sirius with the final phase of their plan. It wasn't complex magic, but it was strong and ideally needed as many wands as possible. Library first, he thought to himself, purposefully as he entered the now desolate common room. At least there was no one there to hold him up now. One of the others had obviously been in the dorm room since Remus had last left it, because it was even messier than before, and the invisibility cloak was now missing. James, who was probably the tidiest of all four of them, had packed all of his things the night before and neatly made his bed. Remus's space was only tidy because it was now entirely empty except for his pyjamas and book by the bedside table. Peter had apparently tried to pack at some point but had been disturbed halfway through. His trunk was flung open, various items of clothing hanging out of it, a pile of textbooks on his bed, and his red tie hanging from the frame. Sirius's bed was by far the worst. He must have come up looking for something at some point, because every drawer in his dresser was open, his bed sheets had been ripped back, and his trunk stood completely empty. Remus grabbed his book bag and left straight away. He would think about it later. He wished he still had the invisibility cloak as he dodged Peeves once more. The poltergeist was in his element, diving into the piles of foam, then bursting out at unsuspecting students and teachers. Remus briefly remembered what McGonagall had said that morning about his father. Boggarts, poltergeists. He wondered what his father, his dueling champion Ravenclaw father who had a temper, had thought of Peeves.
Good afternoon, Madam Pince,
Remus said quietly and respectfully as he entered the library. It was almost entirely empty, and the pinched-faced old librarian was sorting through a towering pile of recently returned books with her wand, firing them back to their shelves with great relish. Lupin, she said, not even turning her head to greet him. He placed his books carefully on the counter furthest from her. Though the library no longer frightened him exactly, Remus was still pretty nervous round Madame Pince, who would clearly have preferred that no students be permitted to touch her precious books at all. Is that all of them? She said sharply. I shall know if not.
Definitely all of them,
he said, backing away slowly.
Mr. Pettigrew has not returned Poisonous Plants of the British Isles, and the elder Mr. Black has 3 overdue Transfiguration books.
Oh, okay. I'll let them know when I see them.
I shall be writing to their parents if I don't have them by 5 o'clock.
I'll tell them,
he repeated almost out the door. Sighing with relief, he made his way to the hospital wing at a leisurely pace, fighting the urge to throw himself headlong into a snowball fight the Hufflepuffs were having against the Slytherins with the foam. It seemed that the spell was still going strong. Even more bubbles were emanating from the bathrooms as he passed, and if he wasn't much mistaken, they were growing larger. He had no idea where Sirius, James, and Peter were at that moment, but he knew they had to be enjoying themselves immensely.
Remus, dear,
Madame Pomfrey smiled as he entered the hospital wing.
Thank you for stopping by. I know you'd much rather be having fun with your friends today.
He shrugged with a small smile.
I don't mind.
Just a few things before the summer begins. Shall we go into my office?
He followed her in and accepted the plate of biscuits she offered him gratefully. His stomach was growling from having missed lunch.
Now,
Madame Pomfrey sat down, conjuring up his patient notes from thin air.
I've tried contacting your matron in St. Edmunds a few times. It seems she's not clear on how the post works. Keeps trying to get me to speak to her on some muggle contraption. I told her we don't have a telling bone at Hogwarts, but I don't think she believes me.
No, Remus stifled a laugh. She wouldn't.
Anyway, between us, we've managed to agree that I shall be present before and after your confinement for both full moons. I've explained to her that your condition has become more difficult over the past year, but that there should be no more danger to anyone else at the school.
Right, Remus nodded. Now that he was used to the idea, he was quite glad Pomfrey would be there, however briefly, over the holidays. It would make the full moon slightly less grim, anyway.
I want you to make sure you look after yourself in the meantime. Eat full meals and get a nice balance of rest and exercise.
Remus didn't have the heart to tell Madame Pomfrey that he had very little say in when he was allowed to rest and how often he exercised while he was living at St. Edmunds. No one at Hogwarts seemed to understand what sort of an institution it was. After that, she checked on a few of his wounds from the previous moon to make sure they were healing properly, then performed some diagnostic spells. It was almost 4 o'clock by the time he was walking back to Gryffindor for what felt like the 100th time that day. Filch had had no success yet in taming the foam, but it had at least stopped spurting from every tap and drain in the castle. The others must have got bored and moved on to something else. As Remus climbed the tower, he saw a few students flying past the windows on their brooms. It was a gorgeous day outside. The other Marauders were probably out there making the most of it. He got a shock when he reached the dorm.
"Hiya, Moony."
James grinned at him. He was alone on Sirius's side of the room. He was packing.
"Nice job getting the umbrellas."
"Yeah, well done on the foam. Filch is fuming."
He rubbed the back of his head, feeling awkward.
"Where's Sirius?"
"Doing something mental on his broom, I think. Thought I'd sort this out for him."
"Do you want help?"
"Nah, don't worry. Didn't you want to read a book or something?" Remus shrugged. He felt a bit embarrassed now. It seemed right that James do it, after all. James was Sirius's best friend.
"It's okay, I'll help you,"
he said casually, as if it didn't matter much either way.
"You know I hate flying."
"Nice of you," James smiled easily, gathering up some of Sirius's mess and sorting it quickly. Remus started tidying up the records, stacking in alphabetical order because Sirius liked it that way. "Put those in my trunk," James said, nodding at the box of records. "The Muggle books, too. Said I'd look after them for him. You know, the way things are with his mum and dad." Remus nodded, carrying them over to James's bed. "Going to be a rubbish summer without the two of you," James remarked, sounding genuinely sorry.
"Yeah,"
Remus replied, not really sure what else to say. "Sirius thinks he might not be coming back in September."
"What?"
Remus looked up, suddenly alarmed. James frowned. "Yeah, he reckons with this betrothal thing, they might send him to Durmstrang. Keep him out of trouble until they can get him married. Pretty drastic, I think, but I wouldn't put it past them."
"The betrothal ceremony might not happen, though,"
Remus said quickly.
"I have a feeling. I just feel like Narcissa won't let it happen."
He didn't want to tell James anything yet, because James would tell Sirius, and Sirius might get annoyed that Remus went behind his back to talk to his family. And what if that didn't even work? He couldn't get anyone's hopes up. "Narcissa?" said James curiously. "What are you talking about?"
"I know she doesn't want to marry Sirius any more than he wants to marry her, that's all."
Remus shook his head.
"Shall I pack his Muggle magazines in your trunk too?" "What a wonderful year it's been!"
Dumbledore beamed at the great hall as the final scraps of the end-of-year feast vanished from their plates. Remus was going to miss the food more than anything, and had 3 helpings of pudding. Ravenclaw had won the House Cup that year, and the hall was decked out in royal blue and bronze silk banners. Every time the Ravenclaw table had cheered during the meal, Remus felt a tug behind his navel and thought of his father. Dumbledore's speech continued.
"I am immensely proud of all of you, of course. Now that we are all well fed, I have a few words I'd like to say. Ready, lads?"
Sirius whispered under his breath, so low that only the Marauders could hear. Dumbledore continued.
Congratulations once again to Ravenclaw, winning this year's...
There was a shriek from the far end of the hall, and everyone spun around to watch every single goblet on the Ravenclaw table suddenly start to spurt red and gold bubbles. They fired upward in great geysers, hitting the ceiling and bursting in a shower of bright droplets, which fell like rain onto the students below, staining their robes with streaks of Gryffindor crimson.
Keep it coming,
Sirius whispered, his voice high with excitement as the Marauders flicked their wands using every ounce of concentration. At once the goblets at every other table erupted too, causing the same effect as students shrieked and began to duck for cover, their hair, skin, and clothes staining vibrant bright red and gold. Not even the Gryffindor table had escaped. Not wanting to miss out on the fun, James had insisted on it. Lily Evans had brought her umbrella and grinned slyly at Remus as Mary and Marlene fought to cram underneath it with her. In the far corner of the hall, Remus caught sight of a furious Narcissa hiding underneath the table, her long white hair streaked with red and gold, which clashed awfully with her porcelain complexion. She was glaring at her wayward cousin so hard that Remus wondered how Sirius did not drop dead on the spot. But he comforted himself with the thought that this incident could have only cemented the idea in her mind that she must escape marriage to Sirius at all costs.
Omnistratum,
Dumbledore said, calmly, aiming his wand at the ceiling. At once the bubbles burst and evaporated into nothing, as though a large force field had suddenly appeared over their heads.
Scourgify!
The headmaster smiled pleasantly, now waving his wand over the whole hall. Instantly the red and gold paint had vanished from the tables, floor, and students. Order was restored. "Ah," James sighed, sounding disappointed.
An excellent way to celebrate Gryffindor's victory on the Quidditch pitch this year.
Dumbledore cleared his throat as students clambered back into their seats, eyeing their goblets nervously.
And while I welcome and encourage displays of house pride, I would like everyone to remember that true sportsmanship lies in the ability to gracefully cede victory. Please join me in raising your glasses to Ravenclaw, winners of the Hogwarts Cup 1973.
Remus had the uncomfortable feeling that though Dumbledore did not look in the Marauders' direction, they were absolutely the intended audience for this admonishment. He felt a little ashamed. But only a very little. It was hard to feel so sorry when there was really no harm had been done, and he was so full of excellent food. James and Sirius were already planning next year's finale, Peter grinning and nodding along like a simpleton. Lily winked at Remus as they raised their goblets, and he hoped that nothing would ever change. Chapter 40. Summer, 1973. Saturday, 30th of June, 1973. Dear Remus, I've only been back at my parents' house for a half an hour, and I've been told I'm bringing shame to my family 5 times. 5. 3 of those times weren't even from living people. The portraits of our ancestors have decided to have a go. Going to start putting up my Gryffindor stuff now, I think. Hope you got home okay. Sirius O. Black. Dear Sirius, your owl arrived before I even got back. We had to get 2 tubes and a bus. It took ages. Sorry about the family stuff. Be careful. Wish we were all back at school. Remus. Friday the 13th, July, 1973. Dear Moony, come and visit soon. Me and Peter will die of boredom. Don't send Sirius any owls. His mother intercepted mine and returned them all with curses attached. Luckily Dad spotted it before we got into any trouble, but bloody hell! I might try contacting his cousin Andromeda to see how she gets post through. I think it's the Muggle way, but Godric knows how we're supposed to understand that. I haven't even opened my Muggle Studies book yet. Let me know if you can come and visit. Remember, Mum said any time. We can talk to your matron and Madame Pomfrey, the Minister of Magic if we have to. James. Dear James, I know how the post works, but I'd have to nick some stamps, and I don't know what Sirius's address is. I asked Pomfrey after the last moon. She said no. She said the wizarding world is too dangerous for me. I don't know if she means I'm the one that's dangerous. Sorry, mate. Moony. Saturday, 5th of August, 1973. Dear Moony. So, you will not believe what happened. Seriously. The ceremony was all ready to go. I was in my hideous green dress robes with black lace cuffs. Lace, Moony. Just wrap your mind round that. You would have thought I looked a right prat. Regulus was there, my mother, father, half the family. Then in comes Narcissa, wearing something that looked like it belonged to my grandmother, and she doesn't look happy, so I thought, well, fair enough, I'm not exactly thrilled. But then she stands up in front of everyone and says, "We have to stop at once." So everyone stops, and my mother looks like she's about to start spitting curses, and my uncle is asking Narcissa, "What do you think you're playing at?" And Regulus is grinning at me, and Bellatrix is grinning too, only she looks a bit more mental than Reg. Then Narcissa whispers something to her parents, and my aunt nearly literally fainted. I shit you not. And everyone's muttering and whispering, and Mother can't take it anymore and demands to know what's going on. So Narcissa stands up and looks my mother in the eye and tells her she made an unbreakable vow to marry Lucius Malfoy as soon as she finishes her NEWTs. I can't remember if I told you what an unbreakable vow is, but basically she can't not marry Malfoy now, or else they both drop dead. I don't know if I should be a bit offended on that point, to be honest. I mean, what does it say about you when a girl would rather die than marry you, even if she is your cousin? Anyway, as you can imagine, the whole Black family is at war. No one is talking to each other because a few curses ended up being thrown between my dad and my uncle. I can't believe Narcissa. Seriously, I actually got close to liking her for a second before I remembered she's still a Black and a Slytherin, and she wants to marry Lucius Slimy Git Malfoy of all people. But it looks like I'm off the hook. There aren't any other cousins left for me to marry now. Everyone's furious, obviously, but for once no one's furious at me. I think I'll probably be coming back to Hogwarts in September. I heard Mum talk about making Reg the heir instead. No skin off my nose. I couldn't care less about inheriting this foul house or their foul fortune. Rather they just leave me alone and keep ignoring me forever. Hope your holiday is going as well as mine, though I can't see how it can be because, honestly, what a bloody result, eh, Moony? See you in a few weeks. Sirius O. Black. Monday, 6th of August, 1973. Dear Moony, I bet Sirius has already told you the news, but just in case he hasn't, the betrothal is off! You were right. It came down to Narcissa in the end. Uncanny ability you have there, Remus, old pal. Don't fancy giving me odds on the Quidditch World Cup next year, do you? Having a really boring summer all by myself. Pete's lot are all off seeing their French relatives, so I don't even have someone to help me practice catches. Hope yours isn't too bad. I had a thought maybe you could ask Madame Pomfrey to bring you to Diagon Alley in August. Or maybe we could meet you and drop you back off after. Mum keeps asking after you, and she'd love to see you again. Get in touch if you can. Yours in eternal boredom, James. Monday, 13th of August, 1973. Postcard depicting the Eiffel Tower in spring. Dear Remus, bonjour and all that from Paris. Hope your holidays are good. Wish you lot were here. Peter. Remus responded to each of these communications with vigour, much more so than he had the year before. The Marauders had seen enough of his handwriting to know how wonky it was, and he didn't think they'd mind a few spelling mistakes. He told James he was very sorry, but could not come to Diagon Alley. Madame Pomfrey said that wasn't safe either, and wouldn't tell him why, and he congratulated Sirius on his hard-won bachelorhood, but did not tell him that he, Remus, had anything to do with it. It would be too much like boasting, and he didn't want Sirius to feel like he owed him anything. Remus's own summer was perhaps just as boring as James and Sirius's, but filled with much more purpose than any summer before it. Madame Pomfrey was true to her word and arrived the evening before and the morning after each full moon. As such, he spent less time covered in bandages and had more time to read and plan for the year ahead. When his books arrived courtesy of Dumbledore and the Hogwarts second-hand bin, Remus was thrilled to be able to get a head start on his reading. Arithmancy was very difficult, but the challenge was exciting, and Care of Magical Creatures was utterly absorbing, if only because of the fantastic colour illustrations. Even Matron commented, somewhat suspiciously, that Remus had changed a great deal after 2 years away at school. "Nice to see you keeping out of trouble," she said one morning when she found him sitting at the bottom of the garden reading a heavy textbook using his magical sheet of acetate. At the time, Remus simply squinted up at her and smiled benignly. She, of course, had no idea that before the summer was over he was to have committed his first serious crime. Ever since his Christmas with the Potters, Remus had been plagued with one particular problem, and he wasn't sure how best to overcome it. Money. He didn't have any, muggle or wizard. Remus was as poor as you could possibly be. This had never mattered a great deal. After all, St. Edmund's supplied his basic needs, and Hogwarts gave him everything else. But he would have liked, at the very least, to be able to return the generosity of his friends. They'd bought him countless sweets and gifts. Sirius had given him the ability to read, for goodness sake, and Lily had single-handedly rescued his summer. For some time now, Remus had resolved to seek out the soonest opportunity that might result in payment. Fortunately for Remus, this opportunity presented itself one hot June afternoon. He was reading again, of course, sitting outside on a bench underneath the shade of an old pub umbrella, which must have been donated at some point since his first year. Now he was 13, while Remus was not among the eldest boys at St. Edmund's. He was no longer at the bottom of the line and could generally escape being picked on too badly. A shadow fell over his book and he looked up. Craig Newman, a 16-year-old skinhead, glared down at him. Craig's gang was at the top of the pecking order at St. Eddie's. They all listened to reggae, wore bother boots and drainpipe jeans held up by suspenders. Some of them had tattoos, and all of them had bruises. "All right, Lupin," Craig grunted at him. Remus blinked, slowly closing his book and wondering if it was much good as a weapon. It was heavy, anyway. "All right, Newman," he nodded, trying not to look small and scared. He slipped naturally back into his old accent over the summer, slurring words and dropping consonants. It was safest. "Chew reading?" Craig squinted down at the book, looking mistrustful. Remus wondered if Craig could read. He shrugged nonchalantly. "Just something for school." "Yeah," Craig nodded. Remus didn't move a muscle. He couldn't understand what was happening. Did Craig really want a casual chat? "You're clever, aren't you?" the older boy said suddenly. Remus didn't know which response was more likely to get him beaten up, so he didn't answer at all. No matter, Craig didn't seem to mind. He just scratched his chin, then pulled a pack of cigarettes out of his shirt sleeve. "Yeah, you're clever, always reading and that." He lit the cigarette with a match from Hit Boot, then offered Remus the packet. Remus reached out and took one. He'd never smoked before, but most of the boys at St. Edmund's did. Craig lit it for him, and Remus inhaled. His eyes filled with tears at once, and he tried desperately not to cough and splutter. It was disgusting. Craig looked at him with amusement and continued. "Small, too. Skinny like." "I suppose," Remus replied, coughing, watching Craig inhale and then trying to copy him. "Fancy coming on a job?" "Job?" Craig nodded, his tiny eyes fixed on Remus. "Yeah, you'd be good. Gonna do over the offie in town. Tomorrow night. Ain't got no security. Ain't got nothing except a dog. Going after the till and the booze. You can have a share. Just need you to pop through the back window." "Right," Remus nodded, as if the prospect did not utterly terrify him. He sucked on the cigarette again, out of habit this time. He could sort of see the appeal once you got over the taste. He considered Craig's suggestion. On the one hand, it was bloody dangerous. Newman's gang weren't known for their finesse, and a few of them were already on probation. On the other hand, it didn't seem as though he had much choice. When Craig Newman wanted you to do something, you sort of just had to do it. Plus, he could definitely benefit. Muggle money was all but useless to him, of course, but there might be a way. Remus looked Craig Newman in his piggy little eyes. "I just want fags." Craig smirked and nodded, and so Remus began his short career as a burglar.